let's get started, everybody. Welcome to our Kenneth Smith Philosophy Seminar. This is our Millennia in Microcosm arc, which will go for many months. We're in Chapter 4, Ancient Civilization. We're exploring the philosophy of Kenneth Smith, who is an existentialist philosopher of the tradition of Hannah Arendt, Philip Rieff, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heraclitus, Aristotle, and so on. And in this book, he's trying to help us get unshackled from the modernist worldview so that we can adopt it or put it aside and put on other worldviews and be able to switch between them and not be trapped by the acculturation that we had before we became philosophically acute. And in doing so, he's trying to teach us about the relationship of any individual of Homo sapiens to their larger culture. And what is it? How do we think using what the culture has given us? And to what extent then is there range for us to be an individual? We are going through Chapter 4, where he describes the ancient civilizations worldview in detail to try to help us not to turn it into a caricature, a modernist caricature of the ancients, but to try to see it in its own perspective. How do the ancients think they saw the world? And to teach us how to do that. And it's made up of lettered sections. We're in section C, which is called Form and Matter, Organicism, and Arete. And it's dealing with the dialectical relationship between our plans for the world, the forms that we want to lay upon the world or ourselves, and the constraints of the matter itself. What will it allow itself to be molded into? What ways can you mold effectively or not mold effectively? And in so doing, we discover that the relationship between them is not a great chasm between two categories, like noesis might logically form is over here and matter's over there and never the two meet. Instead, it turns out that every matter has some form to it and every form has some matter in kind of a yin and yang relationship. And so this gets into the whole issue of the ego and the intellect and how it wants to be pure form and wants to shape the world unconstrained, but instead it finds itself also matter that is being shaped by other forms, such as the culture around us. And so you get this complicated living relationship, which at its best exhibits the symathesis that philosopher Nora Bateson talks about. We are in the third paragraph in this. We've gone through the first two paragraphs where he's introducing this concept of the active and the passive, the ruled and the ruling, pathos and praxis, first to set up the categories and then to explore how they dialectically interpenetrate each other and are more complicated than an either-or relationship. Then we get into this issue of the difference between things that are not very alive and things that are very alive. The more alive something is, the more it is trying to rule itself so that it is not merely passively worn down by the elements and the transformation and processes of becoming of nature, but so that it can harness those forces to try to self-cohere and hold itself together. And that therefore living things live for precisely as long as they're able to manage that, as long as they're able to harness those forces and self-rule. And the moment that they can't do it anymore, that's when death occurs. And in this, we see the ancients saw the world that way. They saw even a rock has a tiny modicum of life trying to, self-cohere in its chemical granitic way. But, an amoeba or a person has a far greater allotage of life that gives us the capacity to work harder to self-rule, to try to hold ourselves together. Because we're all mortal, it's a trick we're always going to fail at sooner or later. But we can keep that dance going as long as we can keep it going and get, try to make as much good come out of it as we can. So these issues of, freedom versus dependency, free will versus determinism, the relationship of the individual to the whole, all of this is deeply related to this question of forming yourself and shaping yourself and trying to, harness the forces to keep yourself going, but also at the same time, not becoming rigid like a rock in which you insist you must not change, but trying to form yourself into a replica of nature itself so that you too are shifting and becoming and are responsively adapting to the world around you. And that's the dance you have to do to stay alive, not to just pound yourself into place and insist that you be unchanging. So in the third paragraph, he gets into this and he talks about the ways that just like a piece of granite holds itself together very differently than an amoeba does. So too, a family of Italians holds itself together in a very different way from a family of Norwegians. Their cultures are different. The forces at work in those cultures are different. And as a result, the forces at work inside an individual Italian's psychology is different from the forces at work inside an individual Norwegian's psychology. The culture has put different kinds of, has how should we say, cultivated different forces of character within the people. And as a result, the way that any given Italian or any given Norwegian achieves their kind of living biostasis, their ability to dynamically respond, it's going to be different. He says a horse cannot be trained by the same methods as a child or a cat, right? The individual character from the culture, from the species, and so on, all of this helps determine what are the forces at work internally that have to be harnessed. And it's why we're not the same person. We talked some about the fact that part of what's interesting about Homo sapiens is that, even though anyone who's raised a lot of animals knows that no two animals are the same, they do have their own psychology. They have their own character. Nevertheless, what we see in other species, within the individuals, the members of that species, we see a much greater fidelity to the frame of the character of the species. That is, wolves are going to differ from each other individually, but around the world. And yet at the same time, anywhere you go in the world, you're going to find a lot of things that they have in common. Their character doesn't allow them an infinite variety of possible expressions of wolf character. There is a strong fingerprint of wolfiness wherever you go. What's weird about Homo sapiens is that evolution has, I can't say broken the frame, but let's say opened it very wide, dilated it compared to other species. We have a smaller repertoire of instincts. There's still some, and there's still, I'm sure there's ways in which any animal looks at any human being and goes, sweet Jesus, what is that? That must be one of those things. But nevertheless, what's striking about us, which he's emphasizing in this third paragraph, is the way that people can be dramatically different from each other. One person could give their entire life, to butchering animals, and that's their career. They look at animals and they see meat, and they're thinking about it as parts, and how do I break it down into food so that I can feed my family and my neighborhood. And another person could go out and become a animal rights activist who spends their whole life trying to stop people from butchering animals. And these two people are seemingly 100% diametrically opposed to each other. You say, how can these both be the same species? You don't see wolves disagreeing about things like, should we kill all the deer now and chop them up into parts and put them in a fridge? I mean, this doesn't even occur to a wolf. But a thought like that not only can, but will occur sooner or later to some person. People can think of almost anything, and that can become the basis for an entire life. And likewise, the cultures themselves that raise people can have those dramatic differences between them. So he's trying in this third paragraph to get us, on the one hand, to understand that enormous variability, to understand that culture is the stupid pet trick of Homo sapiens. It's our excellence, it's our arete, it's our special virtue, that we can be so diverse, and yet also that we can pull together into cultures at the same time in this weird, seemingly paradoxical way. And he's trying to get us to understand it not simply in a nihilistic way of saying, well, why bother looking because they're all different, right? He's trying to say, no, there's patterns. Why do we behave this way? Why is this our psychology? And what does it mean about how human beings organize in groups, and what the duties and responsibilities of an individual human being might be? He's trying to move past sort of a modernist, life is meaningless, so do what you want, might makes right interpretation, to get us into understanding what is the nature of Homo sapiens, whether in groups or as individuals, because that's the foundation he's going to use to build his argument in this section about how the Greeks saw the world and what they thought the purpose of a human life was. This is where the rubber hits the road, is in this transformation. Before I get started, I'll call on Phil, who's got his hand up. Go ahead, Phil. Oops, sorry, I just muted you by accident.
Yeah, I guess before we get started, I do want to say one thing about retrieving the authenticity of the past. I think there's a problem in that. And even Kenneth Smith falls into that and understands that we have our own understanding, and in terms of, let's say, having a dialogue, although it's kind of a one-sided dialogue in a funny way, having a dialogue with the past must mean that we cannot just fall into the past and forget about ourselves, but there is a interaction, or I would say layering of horizons. If we give the past the degree of respect we need, layering of horizon between their understanding and our understanding. And that's what a dialogue is about. So it almost seems, on one level, a futile effort to even try to understand the past. I mean, we could give it as much respect as we need, and that would make it easier. But nonetheless, we can never really totally withdraw ourselves from that, because that, in a sense, particularly when is essentially a one-way conversation, in which even our reconstruction of it is got our handprints all over it, is in some sense a thing that at best is seen through the mirror of our own understanding. I was talking to another group. It was really, we were talking about actually linguistic philosophy. We were talking about, well, not so much Quine, because I didn't like Quine whatsoever, but what is, well, actually, Austin. Austin wrote a book called Sense and Sensibilia. And he wrote that, the title was specifically in reference to Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility, right? In other words, in order to take the sensibilities of Jane Austen and, in a sense, objectified into sensibilia, which can be, in a sense, dissected in its own thing. And I was using the metaphor, when I was younger, I was in Los Angeles and looked at the exhibition. I think the artist was Larry Bell. And he had this thing that was in the middle of the room. It was like a cube, right? Sizable cube, but not huge. And what the cube was, on the one hand, it looked like one of those minimal sculptures. Right? Okay, I've seen this kind of thing, whatever. But what he did was he made the cube out of half silver mirrors. It was a half silver mirror. Half silver mirrors are like something in Southern California, when they have the glass in the building, it's hard for people to look in, but you can look out, okay? But he did it in such a way that, in some sense, you could look in and look out. So what the balance was, that it was truly half silver, in which, like, the past, let's use that metaphor, and the present was, in some sense, a horizon sort of integrate. And it was a very strange experience, because when you were looking through it, and there were people standing on the other side, and it was practically impossible, because I had to constantly check back at me and see if, like, what I see in front of me was not behind me, in some sense, because there was a confusion in terms of space. I think is that sort of something that creates this sort of dialogue of, let's say, the integration of horizons, which was a very interesting thing. It was capturing how should I say, the subjective and the objective somehow were merged together in a funny way, that somehow they coexisted in a funny integration. And so I thought that was very interesting. And most people were like, they didn't understand that metaphor. They thought that was like really strange. And I said, it's strange that an artist who is so interested in the subjective aspect of ourselves is the only one that sort of was advocating for the objectiveness of the other as well as the subjectiveness of this. And so that was interesting, because like I would have thought, if anything, I would have to argue like, well, wait a minute, let's not be so objective. Let's think about the subjective part. But it was like, how is this possible? I explained to them like, why am I arguing for the objective nature of things when when generally people think of art as this way the other way around? So that was interesting. I just want to point that out, that you can never really clear up this subjective objective relationship, because it's a integration of the horizons in some sense.
Thank you, Phil. That's a very important point. And part of what we see going on with this is, like you say, this kind of breakdown of these absolute distinctions between subjective and objective. We discover we can claim that we're objective, but other people are subjective, and therefore they should shut up and listen to us. But in the very act of doing that, to somebody who's got the awareness of what we might actually be up to better than we do, they can realize that it's our subjectivity that has decided it wants to position itself as the authority, as the arbiter of truth, and that wants to position everybody else as having inferior grasp of the truth. That there's a subjectivity that's motivating the apparent surface objectivity that we're claiming for ourselves. And that's one level in which these things break down. And of course, another level in which they break down is when we look at the way that a hyper intellectual like I was when I was younger will in their quest to free themselves, and this is all Hegel's dialectic of the mind here I'm using as the model, when he says that the intellectual, in order to liberate themselves from being a slave to their passions and emotions, will abstract themselves from them and treat their own feelings like it's some phenomena that's distant from them. They create an intellectual creates a distance, and so creates space between stimulus and response, and say, well, I'm no longer just going to punch when I get angry or yell, or I'm gonna ponder and consider and look at those feelings as though they're like seeing a chair that's red over across the room. It's I don't have to do anything. I can think about it, decide how to react. And on the one hand, that creates a scope for freedom that the intellectual prizes. But on the other hand, it actually disconnects them from a fundamental truth, which is that their feelings exist to plug them into the world, to make them sympathetic, to make them relate to what's going on around them. You touch the stove, and the reason you feel pain is to get your damn hand off the stove. It's like, you need to stop burning yourself now. There's a reason why the emotions and feelings short circuit the intellectual thought. It's not a good time for a committee meeting to talk about what this might mean. You got to get the hand off. And obviously it's a it's a two-edged sword. It causes problems, but it also comes with good things. And what that means, says Hegel, is that when you extract yourself from the matrix of your feelings, you are not only liberating yourself from the shackles of the parochial responses you're having, but you're also liberating yourself from reality and your connection to it. And thus you can start rambling on with your theories about how the world works. And I've decided that all Jews are inferior and I'm going to gas them all. These sorts of ideas are based on abstract categories that people build for themselves, disconnected from the real world experience of things. And it's the trap, says Hegel. It's the great danger. We worship the intellect for its powers of being able to let us see into the larger picture of reality beyond our own parochial experience. What is the larger pattern? What might be going on out of our sight? How do we bring that not into the vision of our eyes, but into the vision of our intellect, so that we can have some sense of Germany or Vietnam or Antarctica, what might be happening there? But the problem is it comes at a terrible price. So all these issues of objectivity and subjectivity, says Hegel, they're all far more difficult than we think they are. The subjectivity we're so desperately trying to liberate ourselves from in our goal to become objective people was our connection to the objective world around us. It was the thing that made that matter to us. And now that it matters less, we are on the one hand more and less objective at the same time. Yes, we can theorize and analyze, but that also means that we can reduce people to numbers on a spreadsheet and decide a certain number of deaths per year is a fine savings on our profit margin, better than having to do a recall. These sorts of decisions, come from a disconnect as well as a connection. So I thank you for bringing that up, Phil. And part of what that means too is I'm taking a little time on this, so don't forget your point, Stephen, because I know it's going to be good. But I wanted to take some time on this because, Phil, you've really put your finger on. There is a certain absurdity to the entire project of this book, which Kenneth Smith acknowledges right up front. It's like, we are moderns. And if he's making any point stronger than the others, it's that we think we see the world objectively, but we don't, he says. We are marinating in modernity. We are full of assumptions and distortions and warpages, many of which have to do with positioning ourselves as the pinnacle of history or the pinnacle of creation or the pinnacle of evolution, or at any rate, we're modern, which is better than not modern by definition. It's speaking of Ouroboros, which Stephen brought up earlier. You want to see the ego wrapping around to trap itself within itself. The very word modern comes with the value judgment that says, by definition, we are born better than everybody else. Everybody before was some primitive version of us, and yay, go team. And so, part of what that means is he's trying to say, we are so marinating in that cultural matrix that we don't see the world objectively. If we look at a past epoch, our own fingerprints are all over the picture that we're trying to look at. Like a kid who's been eating sticky candy, we don't even know how sticky we are. We reach out to Mama, kiss me, and Mama recoils in horror. Oh God, not again. I'm gonna have to take another shower. Here we come, right at the photographs, the precious family photo that has the past in it. And there we are with our saliva and sugar going, this is the past. Maybe we were finger painting a moment before. We're like, the past looks better if I put a big smiley face here, and I'm going to draw a little dog in a rocket ship. And next thing you know, you can hardly see the picture because you're all over it. This is the problem that a sticky toddler has when touching precious documents, and this is the problem, says Kenneth, that a modern has when trying to understand the past. We get ourselves all over it, and we see it the way we want it to be and not the way that it actually is. So, what Phil's point is, there's a certain paradox in saying, so we're going to help you get out of that and see the past in its own terms, but isn't that paradoxical? Because the whole reason to do that is to understand the difficulty of doing that and the way we don't do that, the way that we in fact impose ourselves between our understanding and reality. But this is where you have to be selective in what you look at in the past. On the one hand, you have to acknowledge there is a paradox in trying to do this at all. It's just, what do I keep saying about nature, right? You know that the finite mind is starting to approach an understanding of the infinitude of nature when certainties and categories start breaking down, the law of the excluded middle starts breaking down, and you find yourself looking at paradoxes all over the place. Because a paradox is the only way something infinite can fit into the finite mind with the greatest possible fidelity. So this very exercise is paradoxical, but it has to be undertaken. Because even if we can, by definition, never think the way Aristotle thought, or the way Plato thought, or any other ancient, because we aren't ancients, we're moderns. Nevertheless, what we can do is obey the dictum of Franz Kafka when he says that a book should be an ice axe to break up the frozen sea within us. It's like modernity has us in its grip. We are frozen into place. We are not responding to the world the way that we should. What we can do is use Aristotle and Heraclitus and the others to break up our certainties about our assumptions about the way the world works. And when we do that, We may never see the ancients exactly the way they were, but we're going to catch glimpses of them that would have been impossible before we start breaking up all that ice, that ossification. Joints that had been frozen our entire lives in our minds are going to start moving and giving us the ability to look in directions we never looked before. There's a phenomena that occurs, we've talked about when you're reading Kenneth Smith, because of the difficulty of his language and the enormous amount of thought he put into it. The first time we read it, we're almost guaranteed not to understand it, because every word we read, we're putting our own definition onto those words, the pop culture definitions, none of which are what he means. But the process of reading him is disruptive enough, because he does that on purpose, that we're going to walk away from having read one of his essays for the first time with more questions than we had going in, including some about maybe these words could mean something else. And the second time we read it, we're going to therefore read it differently. Some of those words we won't read in the pop culture reflexive knee-jerk way. We'll see those in a more accurately Kenneth Smithian way, part way towards what he meant, and it'll change the whole meaning of the sentence. And when that one changes, the sentences around it will change. So there's this process by which, through successive readings and kind of shaking up over and over our assumptions and our terminology and the thoughts we're using, the essay changes for us until by the 10th reading, it becomes a completely different essay than it was on the first reading. I noticed this when I was reading Otherwise and Webb's and his other book of parables. The ones that were my favorites the first time through, and then others that I didn't like at all, they didn't mean anything. I'm like, I don't even know why he wrote that. But by the 10th time through the book, sometimes those ones that the first time through I had no interest in at all turned into my favorites, because reading the other ones had helped to give me the vocabulary and ideas I needed to finally decipher the ones that at first seemed obscure and pointless, until suddenly they shone through with a meaning I couldn't see the first time. I cite this as an example because we know it's happening with Kenneth, because we can check him. We can call him and ask him, why did you write this? Is this what you meant? He'll go, no, this is what I meant. See, over here and here. And we'll go, oh. And then we can reread and go, oh, now all these 15 other parables all mean something different, if that's true. So we know that it's possible to use this iterative, incremental, dialectical approach to the text to open up meaning that wasn't available to us at first. We know that can happen because we've got Kenneth to confirm it for us. So where it gets interesting is that Kenneth is modeling his style of writing in part on people like Aristotle and Heraclitus and Plato, right? He's trying to do what they did, which is to write in a way where the text has more depth to it than ordinary text in a newspaper or magazine, in which it rewards that kind of digging because he's making allusions and references to other philosophers, to other history, and so forth. And so the more you go back and dig in it, the more you can find, and it helps you to kind of triangulate back and forth towards the direction he's trying to go. He's modeling that on those earlier writers, which means if we use the same technique with them, we may never end up where they are, but they can take us on a journey through successive readings the same way to get us more in the direction of the ancients. The key point is that you don't have to fully archaeologically reconstruct the ancient worldview in order to get the benefit of this project that this book is about. All you have to do is get far enough away from the modern dogma to be able to look back on the modern dogma and see it outside of yourself, to get the new perspectives on it. And that allows you to question the things that previously you couldn't question. So I'm agreeing with Phil, basically. I'm saying, yeah, we're never going to have a photo replica. Our minds will never be capable of thinking in those ways. And that's unfortunate in some ways. It means there's some meanings that are going to be lost to us forever. But it's not a complete disaster. We can reconstruct some of it. And in some ways, it's also good, because Kenneth's not trying to say that the Greeks, achieved the right way of thinking, and if only we could all go back to it, we'd have utopia. Kenneth doesn't believe in utopia. He's like, there were problems with the ancient worldview, just like there were advantages. And if we were fully immersing ourselves into that worldview, we would be thinking with those problems too. We would be the ones who would be saying, well, once we defeat a city, we should kill all the men and sell all the women and children into slavery and raise the city to the ground. That would be reasonable to us. And, maybe it's okay that we can't fully position ourselves within that ethical system and feel comfy there. That's all right. But we'll still get that distance, that what Hegel would call the negation of modernity, that allows us to step outside of it and get a new perspective. The whole point of this entire exercise is what Kenneth Smith calls the Archimedean standpoint. We're trying to get a position outside of the system that lets us get enough distance to look back at the system and see it in a way that's impossible to see from within the system. We're the fishies trying to discover water. And the only way to do that is to get out of the water and look back and go, what the hell is that? Because as long as we're in it, it's everywhere. We can't see it. So I belabored this point, but to agree with Phil, because I think what Phil brought up really goes to the heart of why this book exists and why we're taking the time to go through it. We're wrestling here, right? We're wrestling with culture and identity and perspective, the core stuff to epistemology and axiology and philosophy. Stephen, go ahead.
It was the bit between the family of Norwegians and Italians prompted my memory there. It seems to be connected with the scholastic arguments. Now, the medieval realists would argue that, for example, there is a category of wolves, and they exhibit pretty much the same traits. And that was a medieval realist. And then the nominalists came along and said that's complete nonsense. There is no such category. Please direct me to the wolf in general. Tell me which stretch of the forest I have to go to meet the one wolf which expresses all the wolves. And somebody was saying, well, he felt that the medieval realists were correct about the category of wolves as the category of Italians or the category of Norwegians, that there is such a Platonic ideal out there somewhere. And he said that, but the nominalists were correct about numbers. We've created an artificial category with numbers. Because he was pointing out that number one and number two are completely different animals. You can't put a one in your program where a two is going to go usually, or you're in deep trouble. I didn't understand that, and so many years later, a friend of mine was going to the casino and was convinced that his number system was going to work, and for a while it did seem to work, and then eventually lost all his money. And I was experimenting with a roulette wheel on my Commodore 64 or whatever it was at the time. And I suddenly felt, then I understood what the nominalists were going on about, that, thinking a number system will work is delusional because every number is unique. There isn't really a relationship between numbers. Because one came up, or, because red came up 50 times in a row doesn't guarantee that black's got to come up more often at some point.
Right.
Every throw of the die is a unique and individual thing. Of course, I had another friend who said, stop studying the scholastics. They're a complete waste of time. As far as he was concerned, scholasticism was something that happened between the ancient Greeks, which was something important, and modern thinkers, which was something important, and the scholastics were just talking a complete waste of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, this is important stuff. It's before I started reading Kenneth Smith, although I liked medieval history, I didn't care at all for medieval philosophy. And part of the reason is I didn't understand it. I like most moderns, the Dark Ages to me were a scapegoat. So all the bad things were in the Dark Ages, and that way the modern era could be the good era. And like most moderns, I had a fluid relationship to the line between the ancients, between the medievals and the moderns. I could move it back, when I wanted modernity to be long, but when I wanted my modernity to be good, I would just move it closer to the present and say, all that slavery stuff, that was medieval. And the genocide, that was also medieval. And the Inquisition, that was medieval. And next thing I knew, I'd narrowed modernity to this tiny little slice. And, that was all in order to support my good feelings about myself as a modern. But then at other times, I wanted, as a modern, to be able to take credit for the Renaissance, and Leonardo da Vinci and the Age of Discovery. And then I would move that border back into the past and, hey, look, now Leonardo is a modern. He's really just like us, isn't he? And so there was this whole thing that I was doing that was all treating the medieval epoch as having no significance of its own. And therefore, it could be whatever I needed it to be from one moment to the next. And as long as I was thinking that way, I was incapable of taking medieval philosophy seriously. I just saw it, as many moderns do, as a stepping stone from the glorious ancients to the glorious we, who are now the pinnacle of creation and benefit from the glorious ancients, with that unfortunate dark period in the middle. But what I learned from Kenneth Smith is the medievals, in their weird way, are wrestling with some very important issues on the one hand, and some of them they dug into more than anybody before or after them. And on the other hand, it's really not possible to understand what a modern is until you know what a medieval is, because some parts of medievalism we revolted against, and we define ourselves above all as being not that. If you don't know what that is, then you don't know what not that is. But as always happens with these changes from one epoch to another, we only overthrew some of the ideas, and other ideas we bring through almost entirely intact, whether we're aware of it or not. There is a lot of medievalism in modernity that moderns don't like to admit to. As Kenneth says, one of the best ways to understand a person or a culture is to look at the things they're not willing to think about or talk about. What are the lacunae that have to be left out in order to complete the picture the way they want it to look? What parts of the world do they need to not acknowledge? And when we look at those parts, especially pick out and look at those parts, we learn things that there's no other way to learn. So the medievalisms of modernity can only be learned by studying medieval philosophy. So we will. This book is, after we finish chapter 4, which will probably take a couple more months, honestly, because it's covering a huge amount of ground. But after we finish it, we're going to get a nice run of chapters on the medieval worldview. We're going to learn a lot from that. So why don't we dive in? That was where we left off. We left off with the sentence, life calls for an intelligence more like an art than a science, because the rigid categories, the either or categories, whether it's form and matter, whether it's ruler and ruled, passive and active, all this stuff, these rigid categories are fine for logic or computers. They don't work very well for understanding the nature of human existence. We are often paradoxically both things at the same time, and not in some kind of weird blenderized mash, but in a Heraclitean dialectic of forces that are bound together into an anatomy. And it's when we look at the anatomy of those forces that we understand beyond the paradox into what is it that makes us tick. Are we an individual or are we a group? Well, yes. Where it says Heraclitus, let us embrace the paradox, but let us go beyond that and say, what is the exact relationship of an individual Homo sapiens to the larger group? How does that work? How does that both form the culture from the individual, and how does it form the individual from the culture? And then also, how do each of them on their own have their own identity separately? It's all 4 parts of the dialectic have to be worked out. So let's go into the text that follows. I'll just paste this in here and we'll work our way through it. What binding powers enable an individual to hold his life together? All right, so here's that theme of harnessing the forces to keep reimposing your form on the matter of yourself, and that's how you stay alive. And when you can't do that anymore, you're dead. What binding powers enable an individual to hold his life together, to master tendencies toward chaos, That is the centrifugal. Stephen has often brought up for a centripetal force versus centrifugal force, right? The binding forces to hold yourself together is the centripetal force you have to generate in order to stay alive. And you have to do that because you will always have centrifugal forces to pull you apart. From the changes around you to the changes inside you, there's always things that are willing to scatter you into chaos. And remember, when you're reading Kenneth Smith, especially in this chapter about the Greeks, his interpretation of the definition of chaos is going to be the Greek interpretation. The word chaos can't be understood without the word cosmos. It comes from the Greek military. In the Greek military, the cosmos was the cohesion that holds the Greek fighting unit together to allow you to survive a war. And chaos is what happens when the centrifugal forces of bad morale or, the impact of the enemy or whatever scatter your organization. And now you don't have a cosmos anymore, you have a chaos. So also inherent in this is all those Greek creation myths that say in the beginning was chaos. And from the chaos, various forces entered and created a cosmos. All right. So there's all of this is tied to Greek theogony, the Greek conception of the gods and their relationship to nature. He simply is always referencing them if he uses either the word cosmos or chaos. The whole package comes together. To master tendencies toward chaos and concentrate his full resources of talent and insight. So this is talking about using whatever gifts you've got to try to harness those forces and hold yourself together and be alive. Whether it's as an individual, like he cites here, whether it's as a culture, whether it's as a polis, what have you. Always there are these issues that Stephen brought up about the centripetal and the centrifugal, and how do you relate them to each other to have a life. Says, and of course, insight, we're talking about worldview here, right? This is all the stuff we've been alluding to about why we're studying different worldviews have to do with, will the worldview give us the insights we need into ourselves and the larger world to make it possible to do what he's talking about in this first sentence. And his core argument is, in modernity, it doesn't very well. We're a deeply anti-philosophical epoch, and it causes us to misunderstand a great deal about ourselves and our culture and our world. And those misunderstandings damage our insights. They reduce the resources that we have to try to hold our lives together and to live in a sustainable fashion. This is the challenge of the entire book, kind of captured in one sentence, hinted at here. It says the Greeks do not expect that generic answers are possible. And now we're back to Stephen and Phil's issues about abstraction and numbers and generic approaches to thinking, noesis, right? The Greeks do not expect that generic answers are possible, except insofar as most humans prove slavish and conformist. And by here, he's talking about the way that we enslave ourselves either to our feelings and our memories and our sensations in a parochial but rich fashion of the doulos, or whether we enslave ourselves to our logic and our intellect and our ideologies, distanced from our feelings and senses, the way that a Banausos does. The twin traps of the basal metabolic functions of the mind that we're all born with. This is going to capture the majority of people. They'll never get past this. It's only a minority that will ever get past. And how far they get past it will depend entirely on whether, their culture gives them the resources they need to master these tendencies. So most humans prove slavish and conformist. Pathetically, and here we're talking about pathos. He doesn't mean pathetically like, oh, that's bad, you're a bad person. He means pathetically as in pathos. They're not active, they're passive. They're suffering this relationship he's about to describe. Pathetically relying on solutions that most other people have come to rely on. If they couldn't look around and see other people giving them examples of how to live, they couldn't come up with it themselves. They just don't have the resources of character to control themselves. They can mimic people who can control themselves if there's a lot of them, and by mimicking them, they can get some control over themselves. But if they don't have those examples, and all they really have is the mimicry, the basal mimicry that we're all born with, and the joy that we all feel when we imitate a dog, the joy we feel when we see a politician or an actor on TV and we listen to their voice and go, well, that's distinctive. And then we put it on mute for a moment, and then for a moment we try to do the voice. Well, howdy, partner. We're like, hee hee hee. There's a part of us inside that's tickled every time we do mimesis. We've all got it. And so, everybody's got at least that. And that's what he's referring to here. If we can see other people around us doing things that allow them to successfully, get their lives under control, then most of us, no matter how pathetic or slavish or conformist we are, can mimic that and get at least some modicum of control over ourselves. So in this isn't just a value. The first time I read this sentence, which was, a couple decades ago, I read it as kind of a sneering value judgment on most people. Most people are pathetic. I read that with the modern word, pathetic, meaning bad. Most people are pathetic. And if they couldn't just conform to other people, then their lives would fall apart. But he's saying more than that here. He's also saying this is a basal faculty that we have. This mimetic ability means that the people with the weakest character most need a healthy culture around them so that they will be surrounded by plenty of examples that allow them to raise themselves up by imitating those examples. It's a life or death issue here, right? We're talking about the ability of people to hold themselves together as a living, whether as a living organism or as a living personality or part of a living culture. If we can't do that, we collapse into chaos, and that leads to death and disease and all kinds of other things. We need to be able to pull this off. But for most people, they can't do it unless their culture is giving them the examples and resources that they need. And that means we have an existential danger in our lives as Homo sapiens. Our ability to succeed or fail is heavily, no matter how clever we are or not clever, no matter where we fall on these bell curves of diversity, as far as what gifts we have to work with, we are heavily dependent on whether we get the support from the culture around us. When we say culture is the stupid pet trick of Homo sapiens, just like flying is for a falcon or swimming very fast is for a dolphin, we're not just saying that's something that we've got. We're saying it's something that we've got because we need it. We don't have the big teeth and claws. We can't run as fast. We can't fly. We can't breathe water. There's all these things other animals can do that we can't do. We've often are described as the generic animal because we're missing all of those distinctive features and we're just sort of like imitating other things. But what he's talking about here is he's saying our special trick is culture. And that our special trick is culture is not just, yay, us, we've got this cool gift, but we need our culture to do for us the things that we need it to do. And if it doesn't do them, we die. I mean, our lives are forfeit. Our health is forfeit. Disaster follows. So on the one hand, he's saying that. He's saying there is a differential distribution of gifts. We're not all equal. That's okay. We should still treat each other as decent human beings. People don't have to be equal to you to deserve your respect and compassion. But we do have different gifts. And some people are going to be more able than other people are to hold themselves together, to put themselves together, to struggle to create a healthful character for themselves. But all of us, whether we've got more of those gifts or less of those gifts, really depend on the culture to give us the examples and resources we need so that we can use our mimetic capabilities, our imitative capabilities. Even though he's not using the word mimesis here, it's running like a story thread throughout these paragraphs. The ability of people to imitate each other is right there in that pathetically, that is via pathos, via suffering, and of course, if he's talking about pathos of the two basic faculties of the mind, he doesn't mean noesis, the intellectual faculty of the bonausos. He means gnosis, the imitative experiential faculty of the doulos. If he says pathetically relying on solutions that most other people have come to rely on, expressed another way, he's saying we are all born with gnosis. Every infant is born with that live wire experience of being able to feel things and react to them. And that basic faculty allows most people to develop themselves. That's how they do it, is by being around other people, listening to other people, experiencing the life the Gemeinschaft, as they say in sociology, of the fellow feeling of being among people who you grow to be more like when you're an infant. That's when he says pathetic, he's talking about gnosis. He's talking about that experience because the thing about gnosis is that rather than imposing ourselves on nature through our intellect and our plan and our ego, like noesis does, gnosis is the yin. It is the letting the world impose itself on you and shape you so that you mold yourself to it in response. The basic symathecy that even an amoeba can do, we can do. That's the gnosis. It's part of the challenge of his language. You look at a word like pathetically, and it's very, very hard not to read that as a value judgment. And of course, Kenneth does mean a value judgment, but it's a far more complicated value judgment than the one that we would naturally read into this sentence, because he's not saying gnosis is bad, right? We read enough Kenneth, he will idolize gnosis as the great missing ingredient of the modern world. The great defect of the intellectual is his abstraction away from his gnosis. This capacity for pathos he sees it as the heart of our ability to get towards wisdom, because it allows us to escape all the ideologies and plug ourselves into reality better. But it does that through pathos, because instead of being the actor, instead of being the form, we're the matter. We're being shaped by the world instead of insisting on always being the shaper. I'm going to pause here and we'll call on some folks. And I'm going to do it in a sort of randomish order. Why don't I start with Donald? Go ahead. I'm going to do Phil last because you got to speak earlier. So let's start with the folks who haven't talked yet.
Well, very good on pathos. That's excellent. You should write that down for your commentary on Kenneth Smith. I'm always reminded in this kind of discussion of a remark that drew almost universal condemnation. Talking about when Reagan was there at Pittsburgh for the cemetery, and he made the comment that the SS soldiers buried in that cemetery, along with the victims of the German war machine, were also victims. And I don't know if Reagan's clever or not, or if he's, just read what was on the teleprompter or whatever. But it's exactly the point you just made. They deserved to live in a better culture. Mm-hmm. And it was not provided for them by those who had the powers of character to do that. There is people are, to those who are given these powers, there are some obligations also bestowed upon them. This might be very Greek, but anyway, I think you made a good point. And I also think this goes back to the question that Phil raised last week about these potentials or powers that we have within us. And how do we distinguish, or how do we begin to know which ones might be good or bad? Because there's a lot of duality in this, like strength, a kind of excellence. Well, it can be used to oppress and to support. They're through this. I mean, no Greek would say something like we would maybe always tell the truth.
Right.
They would know better than that.
Right.
You get people killed, good people killed telling the truth. Anne Frank, she's right up there. Just go up the stairs. Or countless things. But So we have these things within ourselves, these potentials, but everyone does. But what we also have is access to visibility of other potentials through history, myth, acquaintance. We, like, as you said, we see other people. We can follow them. One source is mimicry, of our acquaintances. That's, but we can, I don't know. I read profiles in courage. I didn't find the people particularly courageous, but we can read in history. We can read myth, stories, and see these things which for the more pathetic among us, we might imitate. Or it might be for those that aren't so pathetic, the first time they see what heuristic active would be like. They say, oh, I can do that. So how do we know? That's kind of what Phil asked last week. How do we know which of these things to preserve? And the answers to that, being that we are existentialists, not escapist, is why we look around. It has to come from our own experiences, and it's these experiences of other people, whether living or dead, that we see this as. There's I think at one point in Plato, I think Socrates points out that it's not the soldier that knows the most about killing, it's the doctor. He who can do the most good can do the most harm. And so it takes this development of our own experience. That is, I think we know when we suffer injustice. People say, how do I know if things are good or bad? Well, let a bad person get a hold of you. I think you'll know. Maybe not even quite so bad. I think we see when we were treated justly, or when someone is acted towards us in ways that make us better. We feel that. If these centripetal and centrifugal forces are just metaphors, they're just sort of ways to do it. I don't think they're going to provide much guidance. But if they are really feelings that we feel in our own character, our own person, how do we know? How do we know we shouldn't chain people and beat them? Well, try it. See if you like it. See if it makes you a better person. You're an existentialist, right? You're not escapist. You don't just noetically come up with this stuff. And so this all gets back to our genothi sioton. We have to know ourselves, and we can know ourselves through others and through the effects of others' actions on ourselves, and our effect of our actions on others, and whatever. And this leads me to kind of what a term that we've seen it several times already in our readings, that Kenneth comes back to, connoissorial judgment. How do we know? We have to develop the experience existentially to judge these things. And we have others in our culture who have expressed their opinions. Their judgments are available to us to say, oh, is this better? This not better? Whatever. So that's, I think this whole, this is a very important paragraph. And you did a very, very interesting, very good thing. But I think it answers some big questions, because in this suffering, we can learn. And we learn answer. I mean, obviously, I don't think knowledge of good and evil is written on tablets, or, you know, we turn over a rock and there it says, you know, thou shalt do this. I mean, even if they were, we would have to come to some judgment about whether that was really good or not. There's no way to escape answering that question for ourselves. Well, I guess there is. It's, you know, it's choose delusion, choose escapism. Okay, going back to sleep.
What a charming note to end on.
No, well,
Embrace the delusion.
Well,
no, I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
You know, and I think this hangs together through what Kenneth says very well. And that, you know, it's not that, well, enough.
Thank you, Donald. That's some very good points in there. You know, it's the interesting thing about the nature of pathos and praxis, that they are both two-edged swords. Our temptation is to pick between them and say one of them is right and the other one is wrong, and we're going to organize our entire character and personality and life around one or the other. The law of the excluded middle tells us, you know, there must be right and wrong, true and false, good guys and bad guys. So which of these is the scapegoat, and which one is the source of all virtue and goodness and utopia? And the problem is that, you know, it's a zero-dimensional approach to a complicated subject. You can't just take one of the two choices. And the one-dimensional isn't going to work either, because you can't find some spot on a line between them, which is the right spot you should always be at. This is the nature of the third faculty, you know, Vernunft, that Hegel talks about, and that the Greeks imply, and that Kenneth never uses that word for it. He often uses confusingly, Kenneth often uses the word gnosis as equated to the word Vernunft. It's just a shorthand he does verbally, but what he really means is when he uses gnosis in that form, he's talking about the higher faculty in which you're wielding your gnosis and your noesis, and you're using judgment and experience and taste to figure out instant to instant who's giving you the better answers, or are they both just giving you partial answers and you need to combine them somehow. You know, the dance between the two modes of thought that hate each other and repel each other is what defines an Aristos. And it's why you see in Nietzsche all this reference to the dancing philosopher, Zarathustra, his Nietzsche's vision of the excited, vital philosopher who you know eats life and enjoys it and you know really wants to have the full experience. The challenge is that that's not modernity's picture of pathos and praxis at all. We believe in absolute freedom, and absolute freedom means noesis. It means that we will always be form and never be matter. We will always impose ourselves on others and never be imposed upon. This is like the pseudo philosophy of pragmatism, where we think that we're giving a profound answer when we say, well, I don't go for all these, you know, fuzzy philosophies. I'm a pragmatist. And we don't understand that what we've just said is I'm thoughtless. I don't ever want to think about whether what I'm doing is right or wrong. I just want to know how to do it efficiently so I can get what I want. And of course, philosophy is all about how maybe you should question what you want. What you want might be the problem, and doing it more efficiently might not make your life better at all. You know, there's a pragmatism as an anti-philosophy disguised as a philosophy. And in the same way, we see this with noesis and the way that it scapegoats gnosis. You know, it says, you know, you want to be free, be totally 100% free. But the only way that's possible is if you enslave everybody on earth, and now they all work for you and you don't have to do anything unless you want to. There is this relationship between domination and absolute freedom that we don't want to think about. We don't want the consequences to come home to roost of our sort of lopsided way of looking at the world. So it's a really useful exercise when you're reading Kenneth Smith to watch for these dichotomies between form and matter, pathos and praxis, the doulos and the banausos, the intellect and the experience, the subjective and the objective. Look for them. And every time you see them, you have to pause and reread the sentence at least twice, so that in one way, or maybe three times, in the first way, you read it the way that popular culture tells you to read it. And you say, what prejudices are hiding in my normal interpretation of this word? What freight am I carrying and dumping on this sentence and assuming that Kenneth is saying it when actually it's pop culture saying it? And I'm sort of writing over Kenneth to insert this modernist dogma. Then you can step back and say, so what value judgment is Kenneth making here at this moment in this sentence? You know, when he says pathetically relying on solutions that most other people have come to rely on, there is a value judgment. He is saying that it's slavish and conformist. He is saying, from the ancient perspective, you know, the ancients believed it was better not to rely on the solutions that other people come up with, because what if other people come up with bad solutions, right? Then you become the lemming, not the real lemming, but the, you know, Disney lemming who goes off the cliff with all the other lemmings. You know, you need that ability to resist the crowd when the crowd's doing the wrong thing. And you can't do that if you haven't developed in yourself the resources of talent and insight that allow you to know when to dig in your heels and say, I don't care what you do to me, I'm still not going to go along with you because I think you're all wrong. So on the one hand, that value judgment is here. And you if you can't hear it, then you're not actually hearing Kenneth. He's constantly making value judgments. But the third level is when you think about what does he say in other places about the relationship of pathos and praxis. And then you realize that this value judgment's a lot more complicated. So he's not just saying it's a bad thing, because if you could get rid of all the pathos in yourself, you'd be dead. You know, literally the pathos keeps us alive. Our bodies do things without our volition, without which we would die. And our willingness to allow nature to have its way with us when it's good for us, and to let our bodies have its way with us when it's good for us. It not only is it necessary for life, but you got to think about how often does Kenneth Smith quote Aeschylus? Drop by drop, wisdom is distilled from pain. The unwilling human being resists the lessons of life until forced into it through disaster and pain. And only then do they go, wow, maybe I was wrong. You know, the thing that they couldn't think to themselves, the wisdom that was unavailable to them because they were so determined to impose themselves on the world through their noesis. But in the catastrophe of pathos that they suffer, for a moment, their character dilates just a little bit, and a little of the wisdom of the world is allowed to pour in. Kenneth loves this passage, right? I mean, he and I both love the fact that Robert Kennedy quoted that at the eulogy for Martin Luther King Jr. It was an incredible moment in history like you never see in politics anymore, where, you know, thousands of years of wisdom all came together to help us understand a terrible moment of tragedy and disaster and calamity. In that, you can see how much he values gnosis. You can see how much he values pathos and the role that it plays. And thus, you reread this sentence the third time, and you realize it's not as simple as scapegoating or just saying something's bad. It's a very complex sentence that he's saying here. It has to be, like a lot of life, it has to be experienced paradoxically at multiple levels at the same time. So, Donald, go ahead. I saw you came off mute.
Oh, culture is another one of those two-edged swords. It contains ignorance, foolishness, wisdom, you think of that don't just, maybe don't do things because just other people do them. But at the same time, human beings have discovered some institutions that are quite satisfying to the life of human beings. Long-term companionship, children, you know, yes, are these traps? Yeah, but we have tens of thousands of years of people finding great satisfaction in these. Yes, you would be a mirror if that's the way you want to look at these things. Or you could say, maybe I shouldn't rebel against everything. In some cases, this has been figured out. I can go on to figure out something else. Well, but yeah, the dualities here are just everywhere.
Yeah.
Through this of, are these things good and evil? Well, yeah, I think so.
You're pregnant? That's great. Are you having a boy or a girl? Yeah, probably. Not necessarily, but probably a boy or a girl. It's like, but that's not what I wanted to know. I wanted to fit it into one of my slots and be able to do logical deductions. It's like, yes, I'm sure your noesis wants a 0-point answer, but the truth is these complex relationships and these dialectics and transformations, that's the truth. As Hegel says, the truth is the whole. The whole is the truth, not some little fragment of it. So yeah, this is good stuff. Okay, I think that gets us through Donald's stuff. Joseph and I did some private texting about the question he had, and I'll do some follow-up. So I think I'll turn now to Phil. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I was going to ask if Joseph wanted to speak, but since that's settled, I guess I'll speak. First of all, I want to say, there's a level in which you don't have to have the exclusion of the middle. I mean, there's a gray area in which, and I think that might be because I come from an Eastern culture, at least have part of it, that inaction is actually a third choice. It fits in between, right? Now, inaction could take a couple forms. One is just sort of like apathetic, inaction due to apathy. That's not a positive behavior. But in action, when one is uncertain of what might be the outcome, sometimes it's better to leave things alone until one is certain. I gave the example of me being asked to apply for a job at Morehouse College. Even though I needed a job very much, I decided not to act. Not because I didn't want a job, not because I didn't want to be in Morehouse College. I felt that I was inadequate to deal with it, possibly in a positive way. So the inaction was at a personal cost to me, but it was sort of like an action that was probably an important thing to take, rather than actually, oh, sure, that means more income for me, because I was just like relieved from another job, right? It's like, and there was a lot of uncertainty in my life. And so I think quite often, if you make the affirmative voice for an action, that could be a very important choice versus just apathy, which is actually a non-choice, So that's important. The other thing I want to talk about is that I want to compliment what Donald was saying about, pathos. I certainly agree with that. And in general, I agree that the poets were much more insightful than the philosophers about that. So agree. So that's good. However, I think there's something that we must understand, First of all, I think even the ancients didn't make a sharp enough distinction between what I call nature 1, which is inanimate objects, and nature 2, which is living objects. I mean, it was sort of one general category. And living objects have a kind of pathos, you would call it that way, a desire to move and change and adapt because it lives. And in that sense, they share that with us. And I think the problem, to me, a third problem comes through is that, and I don't want to blame it on anybody, it's just question of civilization itself. Civilization ever became so more and more expansive that it had developed what I call ecology 2, different from ecology 1. Ecology 1 was about adapting, nature adapting and transforming itself and finding the niches it could fit into the laws of nature 1. Let's put it that way, okay? And culture, as it becomes more complex, is such an evolving thing that we begin to have to put more and more focus in a larger and more complex culture. So our attention has shifted almost entirely to culture. And you know, and the way you talk about, at least the Greeks, the dialectic was between, I guess, man and nature in some sense, that dialectic. But as culture developed, it sort of created, how should I say, a diffraction in which we pay less and less attention to that dialectic and more into the dialectic within culture itself, because that is like closer to us, affected our life more and more. And so therefore we have to pay attention. So there became a more and more divergence between equal 1 and equal 2, to the degree that equal 2 became reduced to mere matter that you exploit and extract. And I think that becomes a problem, because when culture becomes that, and of course, intellect, and I should say thinking, where the dialectic begins to be a thinking about the dialectic of thinking itself, because thinking itself is something that's appropriate for, in a sense, moving within equal 2, then in a sense, there became more and more of a divergence. And I think what happens is that this dialectic within culture itself begin to front run nature, okay? In other words, anticipatory, you know, it sort of like predicts what will happen. And so in some sense, and I always have to question, like, does this sort of dialectic necessarily front run nature? I mean, the laws of nature? I mean, quantum mechanics should have informed us that's not true. Because what we have in quantum mechanics, we have the data. The data seem to work, but we have no understanding the causal relationship, except in the probability wave, which is actually an ambiguous, sort of like, I guess, generalized, loose, amorphous theory of what it is. It is not a thing. It's the probability wave is not a thing itself. It's a prediction of what things might be like. And so in some sense, that's definitely a case in which, at least in that case, nature 1 has front run dialectics of this intellect. And I just begin to wonder, and although I appreciate that dialectic of culture, because I also live within a culture, I begin to wonder whether that's not a, I'll just say, I don't want to quite put it into an ego thing, because I think that means whatever, but it could also be that. I just begin to wonder whether that is not the need to control, to have a kind of approximation to a certainty that we cannot achieve. And that's what I mean. You know, I kept using the metaphor of living at the gates of the city. You can't avoid the city. But the funny thing is, if you don't go out of the gates, you're trapped in the dialectics of the city itself. And that's all there is. That's all that is real. And I think that's what we are. And I think that displacement, it's a funny displacement between the dialectic between, let's say, the mind and interiority and nature, which is an exteriority, and the mind producing reason and dialectic within itself, which is also a dialectic, but it's a different dialectic. So that's what I want to say. And when you have culture, and particularly when you have players who insist on being players of malice, then you could hypnotize people into falling into this morass even more than actually even the pure dialectic could
that's right.
understand. So that's my thought. That so in some sense, the Greeks were, well, I guess I have to question the Greeks in this sense, because I think the classical Greeks were already wrapped in that relationship of the dialectic within
That's right.
culture itself.
That's
Because the Mycenaeans and the pre-Socratics, but the Mycenaeans was a whole completely different culture. Should we even include the Mycenaeans as the Greeks? Because there was the dark ages between the fall of the Bronze Age, 1170 and 700 BC. That's 500, 600 years of dark ages. And to think that Homer wrote about the Mycenaeans, that's not a reality. That's a myth. That's a make-believe story. So in some sense, you even wonder whether if that becomes the constitution of the Greeks, which were the Dorians at that time, then in a sense, even the pre-Socratics in some sense were already quite different from the true Homeric age of the Bronze.
That's right. Thanks, Phil. Excellent points. These categories you talk about, nature one and nature two, the non-living and the living, especially if we treat them dialectically, I think are incredibly powerful model. When we look at the way, I took my nephew and his girlfriend and my wife to the Seattle Aquarium yesterday. She'd never been. This is her first time, really spending time in Seattle. And I don't go very often because whenever you live in a city, all the tourist things, even if they're good things, you tend to forget to do. And it turns out some of them are good things for a reason. So, I'm back there looking at it. And among other things, they have these very long tanks that run an entire hallway where they set up waves like tides, like a giant tide coming in. And they've got living fishes and anemones and things in there, and rocks and seaweed and so forth. And it allows you to watch the behavior of these animals and plants when these giant tides of water move in. A great metaphor for the centrifugal forces of life, right? And of course, what you see, which we all know about, but we don't normally see because it operates on the wrong time scale, too slow for us, is, the rock doesn't adapt. The big heavy rock, which isn't moved by the wave, instead gets pummeled by the water, which is carrying along sand and other fragments that, wear it away. And so over time, the rigid cliffs get worn down. We look at maps of Anglo-Saxon England from 500 or 600, and what we see is a lot of villages and towns that used to be important places are underwater now because the cliffs eroded and fell down, and the villages fell down with them, are now down there. And it's a little hard to fully grasp because there's something about looking at a modern map that makes you feel like you're looking at reality. The intricate shapes, of everything on it, it has the fingerprints of reality. And it's hard for us to fully grok that it's only the fingerprints of a moment of reality and that things have changed so much. But it's because the nature one that Phil's talking about doesn't involve, I don't want to use the word conscious, but let's say deliberate symathesis, right? The amoeba will deliberately, if not consciously, shape itself and change itself to adapt to what's happening around it. But the rock can't. It doesn't have that degree of flexibility. Its strong crystalline structure is too strong and doesn't allow it to respond or detect. Its pathos is greater than the pathos of a living organism. So, a living organism is able to engage in pathos through praxis. It can change itself to adapt to its environment. You know what I mean? That is to say, the rock has no idea what's going on and is being shaped by the environment. But the amoeba actually is sensing the environment and is more aware of the incoming forces, and thus it can change itself to harmonize with those forces better than the rock can. And in harmonizing it from the outside, the result looks more like a pathos, right? It's not trying to fight the forces. It's not putting up a big fist and going, no, waves. It's adjusting just the way, better than the rock can. And as a result, this is the old thing about the willow that bends and the rigid tree that can't bend and breaks in the wind, right? The nature one is a realm of extreme pathos through a lack of symathesis. And nature two becomes this living realm in which symathesis is possible to allow praxis to emerge and aid pathos so that the wave doesn't have to hurt you. The most amazing thing was watching next to the rock. Here's the seaweed, pulsing with the wave and recovering, no problem. And here's the fish who, when the wave swooshes through, and it's a lot of water, the entire school of fish swooshes down, and then after it passes, they swim back to where they were and hover again because they know where they were. And they don't want to just tumble down the stream, like a small rock would or a piece of sand. They're where they want to be, near the plants they want to be by, and so forth. So they go with the water, which the rock can't do. And then afterwards, when there's not so much force, they come back the other way and reestablish. And so if you were to look before and after the wave, it would look like there was no change. No will had been exerted. It was just a pathos. They're just hovering in the water. But this incredibly interesting thing happened involving their volition and their adaptation and adjustment in order to create this illusion of stasis. And that's what he's talking about in this essay when he talks about harnessing the stuff of life. Your talent, your insight, whatever you've got to use it in order to reshape the forces within you and around you in order to persist and endure and to have a life, to be a living thing. All of this stuff is just deeply in there. So Phil, I think that this dichotomy that you create, especially in a dialectical sense, is really useful. It's very interesting. It allows us to talk about the differences with and without symathesis, what kind of relationship to pathos and praxis are possible for nature. Likewise, the distinctions on ecology 1 and ecology 2. So thank you for that. I'm probably going to incorporate it into the footnotes in this book because I just think it's very illuminating what you said. Stephen, go ahead.
I've spent many years listening to, the various groups lecture themes on existentialism. I could note that the atheists are worshipping science like it's a god. It's become the new religion for them. And I view religion and science as being two ends of the same pole. And what they failed to notice with religion was this, that science pulls things apart. I could get the mechanical clock, as you did, pull it apart and never get it to work again. But there are people, of course, that can put that mechanical clock back together and make it work. It doesn't work with cats. You can pull the cat apart and make it a load of cat parts in a bin, and then the guy will try and sew it back together, but it's not going to work anymore. Your cat's just not going to work. Whereas a monk would say, oh, no, you just watch the cat. You read the cat. You watch the cat run around you. And you think of a person who can track animals. They've developed an unusual ability to read the signs of nature. And that's not a part of the mind which is analytical. It's a part of the mind that allows itself to be impressed by the subtleties of natural experience. But no. We're now living in a world where all these guys are saying that the scientific method is always and absolutely the way to go. We're going to keep on pulling that cat apart, sewing it back together, and one day we'll get there. It'll start running around again. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, there's Kenneth loves to talk about the etymology of the word science. She says is related to schism and shingle and scintillation and shears. It's about cutting. Analysis, the analytical faculties of the mind, which noesis constitute. The analytical faculties of the mind are all about taking a whole and breaking it up into parts. This is what Hegel talks about when he diagnoses Verstand and how it works. He says dividing it into parts is how you create the categories and pieces that you need for your logic. Your logic wants to move parts around within categories, so it needs things to be dissected so they can be fit into tidy boxes. The other faculty of the mind, gnosis, doesn't do that. Instead of cutting things to pieces and then trying to reassemble them, it experiences wholes and adapts to try to fit into the whole better, to make a stronger whole. And this whole forming faculty of the mind, I was just talking with my coworker Ken yesterday. We almost don't have a word for it in English. I mean, in theory, the opposite of analysis is synthesis, but in truth, the word synthesis for decades has been used to mean to create, to form, and it doesn't sound like a thinking word. Analysis sounds like a thinking word. It's like a thinking word in which you might have some practice to go with it. You might, get tools to help you analyze, but it's a form of thought. But synthesis doesn't sound like a form of thought. It sounds like you have a machine and it's making stuff. And as a result, literally, gnosis is inexpressible in English. It's just that and because we can't say it, we can't think about it very clearly either. It's like that whole, I would say half, since there's two baseline faculties, but as Hegel tells us, we use them to build a third one. So really 2/3 of the faculties of the mind are inexpressible just because we lean so hard into cutting things into pieces to fit them into categories and so far away from the gnosis. It creates massive blind spots in our understanding of ourselves and our world. And it's going to come up over and over, and it's a theme that he's going to hit on. So thank you for that, Stephen. So let's pick up the text and go a little further, because we've got time and we're making good progress. I think we've really managed to explore some of the themes that are under the surface so far. So the next thing he says, he quotes Oscar Wilde, and this is another of Kenneth's very favorite quotes. He will quote this all the time. Not every article, not even every third article, but it's going to come up over and over. And even when he doesn't quote it, he's going to be dropping words from this quote in various places. And eventually you'll learn to notice if any part of this quote is present, he's thinking about Oscar Wilde. Most people, said Oscar Wilde, are other people. They have no more personality than a mirror. And the Fuller quote is very poetic. It comes from his book De Profundis, which he wrote while he was in prison, and it's talking about the nature of identity and character, and it's just such a profound statement. Kenneth likes to collect parables and quotes that, regardless of what the author might have originally meant, do a really great job of concentrating an enormous amount of insight into just a few words. Most people are other people, right? This is the gnosis, the pathos of growing up, when people are not choosing who to become, they are mimicking who to become. And they may not mimic any specific individual, And that may lead them to think that I'm an individual because I'm a unique combination. But Oscar Wilde says that's not enough to count as a person. I mean, you're sort of a default person. Yes, you're unique, but you're a symptom of your culture rather than being anybody in particular. Anybody could be some combination of other people that are around, because those people are around. This is the real world, right? Anybody could imitate them. To be a person in yourself, you have to do more than mirror what other people are. And more than just cherry pick. I'll take this feature from that person and that feature from that one, and congratulations, I've made a unique combination. It's like, yes, but it's a unique combination of other people. It's still not you. Who are you? And part of the reason why, Oscar Wilde and others, Kenneth Smith and others would deny that this counts as individuation is for the reason Stephen was just talking about. If you take parts of people and you sew them together, you don't end up with a person. You end up with a Frankenstein's monster, like Mary Shelley warned us, right? It's not getting to the heart of what makes those things tick. How are they growing and transforming? What were they before? What are they becoming? They're not an object. They're in a process of growth. And if you're taking bits out of different people, each of those bits was part of a different system of growth from something else to something else. They've all got directions pointing every which way. And they made sense in their original context, where they were part of a growing whole organic character or personality. But now you snip off this bit and that bit and you jam them all together. And what you have is a bunch of forces working against each other. None of them knew about the others. None of them were adapted or grew out of the others. They didn't grow out of the same matrix underneath. And so you have chaos instead of cosmos. But we don't teach people to understand personality at the level of character. We teach them to understand it as he collects comics. He likes oranges. He gets pictures of unicorns, right? We look at these surface symptoms and we say that's the personality. And those things can be picked up and moved from place to place, right? They're more like objects of the human personality. You can just say, okay, well then I'll collect unicorns. Congratulations. But it still doesn't make you a person. It's just some kind of pattern of consumption. To be a person, it's your character. What are the principles at work inside of you? What is the deep soil of your personality from which your new changes over time are going to grow? Right? That's the important thing to understand. That's where the direction of your life comes from. It doesn't come from these little odd fiddly details. It comes from, are you willing to say no, against somebody who has a gun pointed at you? Are you willing to resist a crowd? Are you able to agree with a group when they're right and you're wrong? All these different kinds of things go to the roots of character rather than these sort of collectible trivia memorabilia stuff. But the way that we teach human personality doesn't prepare us to think in those terms. And it's because of that analysis that Stephen was talking about. We recognize the parts of human personality that most fit the model of pieces and parts, because we're using our noesis, and our noesis can only see pieces and parts. So when we look at a person, that's all we see. We say, your arm is a part of you, we say. And the truth isn't anything like that. Nobody made it in a factory. It was not separately designed and bolted on. It can't be taken off and put back on. It has none of the qualities of a part. It is a region of the organism. It is a bud that grew out of the rest of the organism according to its own natural laws. And it doesn't stop being part of the organism just because it's sticking out here, right? Its noesis looks at something sticking out and thinks to itself, I could cut that off and then it would be a part. And we think that so readily and smoothly, we don't even notice that we're thinking that we could cut it off. But when you visually look at it, it's like there might as well be a dotted line superimposed over the top that allows you to say, the rest of you is one part, and this arm is another part. It's like they say in hospitals, every different medical discipline has its own personality type that's attracted to it. And surgery attracts people who look at people and see lots of dotted lines for where to cut. And all the surgeons I talk to, not if you attack them or, criticize them, but if you hang out and have lunch and you talk and you're friendly, they'll say, that's exactly what I see. Every time I look at a person, I'm like, okay, a prefrontal lobotomy, I cut there, to do a bypass, I cut here, and, if there was gangrene of the left finger, the pinky, this is where I would make the cut and how I would sew things together. They're seeing the dotted lines, and that's useful to the rest of us, because if they couldn't say it out loud, we might not even know that we were doing it too, because it sounds so outlandish. But there they are doing it, highly educated, refined people using their noesis. And that helps us to understand why it is that when we look at the world, we too are seeing dotted lines and separating things that are actually wholes and imagining parts where they aren't there. Because that's what we want to see. The way that noesis warps the world is anything that doesn't make sense in terms of pieces and parts, noesis pushes into the background as either not important or maybe not even a thing at all. And all the things that can be represented as pieces and parts, noesis pulls to the foreground as that feels real, that feels meaningful. I know how to reason about this. I can make categories and conclusions about this. Therefore, it's interesting to me. It comes to the front. By the time this sifting of foreground and background has been done, what noesis sees is very different from what was there, what's actually present. That's the distortion. So most people, said Oscar Wilde, are other people. They have no more personality than a mirror. This is partly because we do that mimetic thing, and we do it in a noetic way because we're moderns, which is very weird. Because mimesis is mostly a gnosic thing. It's a basal, immersive faculty. But we've been so Apollonianized, noeticized, intellectualized by modernity that even when we're doing gnosis, we do it to serve a noetic end, to produce noetic information. It's very weird. We'll get more into that. Geneva, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask what you thought Kenneth Smith would feel about, because I've been reading Proust, and one of the concepts that Proust gets at is, like you were talking about, you could put the lines on and you could cut off an arm, or how to do a lobotomy and that sort of thing. But one of the things that Proust was obsessed with is, if you did an autopsy on a person, where would you find love, hate, ideas,
Yes.
hurt, pain, that sort of thing? And that I'm wondering, where or how would Kenneth categorize that sort of thing? Because I wonder that too. Like, there's no way to autopsy those types of situations. You can cut off an arm or a leg or do a lobotomy, but there's no place to cut to find those emotional situations. So I'm wondering, what do you think he would say about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a Kenneth Smithian question you're asking. It's exactly the sort of question he loves, which is, and as you say, Proust is pointing out, okay, yeah, my arm is important, but would I rather lose my arm or my capacity to love? I mean, if I had to choose one, I'd let the arm go and keep the capacity to love, because without that, I got big problems. But to the noetic mind, love can't be real because you can't find it. There's no dotted lines you can put around it and say, here's where it is. And for this reason, what you'll see today, the way that noesis expresses love these days, is they'll tell you it's a single neurotransmitter. Maybe it's oxytocin. Maybe it's, acetylcholine. But you can find, if you Google, you can find articles where people are attempting to equate a specific neurotransmitter with love itself. Now, if you put that side by side with the people who say, well, love isn't just a feeling, it is a lifelong commitment to one another, where, as your feelings ebb and flow, you're still going to take care of each other. It's this decision, it's this covenant, it's this whole course of life. You're hearing holistic description of love, right? From those people. And you put that, And you can see that anybody who's been in a long-term relationship can see that, yeah, love isn't a momentary feeling. It is this big, complex relationship. It has a wholeness to it that transcends any given moment or thing or object or part of the body or neurotransmitter, right? But to a noetic who may even have read that same essay about love being all of those things and may have nodded and said, oh yeah, there's some wisdom there. Well, then the very next day, turn around and say, love is oxytocin, because the noesis needs it to be an object or a thing or a substance that's isolatable. All things have to be isolatable because the noetic personality is an atomist, wants to break things down into Legos that can be snapped together or snapped apart. Whether they can or not, it needs it to see that way, because noesis can't tolerate anything else, because noesis can't function if it can't take things apart and snap them back together again. So Kenneth Smith says, boy, the question you're asking is right on the money. That's the issue. And it, you know, when Nietzsche says man would rather will the void than be void of will, he's talking about noesis and its need to impose itself on things. Even if I have to distort the thing that makes life living for me in order to fit the concept into my schema, I will still do it, regardless of, you know, maybe now, you know, I start mistreating the people I'm trying to have relationships with and they all leave me and I don't, you know, and I'm lonely, but I will still do it because I can't stop myself, because I got to scratch that itch of breaking everything apart like it's all toasters and not recognizing that actually a lot of things are cats. You can't pick them apart and put them back together again. Yeah, it's a brilliant question. Thank you, Janira. That goes right to it. Proust. I got to read more Proust. Phil, go ahead.
I may have a slight problem with the dialectic in this sense. Okay. For living things, things are real when it's in the process of action and doing and transforming. In other words, within time itself. And my thought is this way: when I'm engaged in something, doing something, or thinking about something, in a strong way, I own it because I'm there. I'm with it. Okay. So there it is. And the content is there, but I'm with it. And the content is almost secondary to me being with it because I'm absorbing it in some way. Now, let me assume that I went to a very interesting lecture by somebody who's a very engaged, I should say very engaged, a very wise speaker, and I'm listening intently. Now, there's two things that happens. One is, as he's talking, I'm thinking about what he's talking about, and I'm seeing, oh, yeah, I agree with that, and no, that part I disagree with. I'm engaged with it. I'm there. I'm owning it, okay? It is me. It's not somebody else, it's me. But what if I was listening passively, like, oh, you know, okay, that content is wonderful. I'm just sort of like, I'm just absorbing it. It's not that I'm not there. It's that I'm in the background and the content is more in the foreground. And I am not sure whether I own the content or whether it's been superimposed unto I, unto me. So insofar as I live, I move through active stages and passive stages. Do I just become so passive, let's say, that I fall asleep? I no longer am there. I mean, but on the other hand, I am there when I fall asleep. Okay, you can say, oh yeah, but your subconscious is always working. I suppose you could get that out. But nonetheless, you have to figure out a way, even in a dynamic system when things become real, how one could exist in an active stage engage, being a part of. By the way, that goes back to, in a sense, you could never get back into the authentic Greeks because you are actively engaged, right? Rather than passively feeding into you, and that you, in some ways, you don't even care about. And I think that's part of the problem with many people who just sort of passively accept, this sort of indoctrination, so to speak. But on the other hand, we exist many moments in our life when we are passive. How do you account for existence in those times? I mean, so there's a little bit of ambiguity that I'm trying to go through.
Yeah.
But I certainly will say when I'm there and with it, I'm definitely there.
Yeah.
As me being present with the thing, and owning the thing, right? It's mine in some sense. It might be his, but I'm engaged with it. Part of it is definitely me. Okay, so I just want to ask that question. That's an ambiguity that I have to deal with at all times.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it's part of what's interesting about the structure of the human mind is that we use both faculties more or less all the time. Now, when we are newborns, when we're deeply immersed in gnosis and we really have not yet developed our noesis, at that stage in our development, it's possible to be close to 100% passively experiencing life, but not entirely possible. And we start developing the noesis almost immediately, even if it's unrecognizable at first because of how limited it is. But once we've developed it, part of the reason we have a bicameral mind is so that we can be simultaneously experiencing with a thing and also abstracting ourselves from it and analyzing the thing at the same time. We got to be able to do both things. And that takes effectively two brains, right? It's the only way that you could pull it off, right? Otherwise, the brain's busy. Whichever one you're doing doesn't leave room for the other. But, the anatomy of the brain makes clear, the intent to be able to, if you will, hold two thoughts at the same time, to be able to look at things in two different ways at the same time, and thus the gnosis and the noesis. But what's interesting is when we look at the way the human character development happens, where people gravitate towards one or the other, it's not that they stop doing the other mental faculty, it's that they make the other mental faculty the servant of the one that they have made their master. And so is the noesis serving the gnosis, or is the gnosis serving the noesis? Becomes the kind of the differing structure. So active listening is an illustration of this paradox. In order to be more immersed in the experience of learning, you need your noesis involved so that your will isn't off doing something else and distracting you, right? And your will needs to be engaged, and you're asking questions, and you're thinking about, do I agree or not agree? And you're wrestling with it. And because you're wrestling with it as well as experiencing it, both faculties are oriented towards it. But if your noesis isn't engaged, then it's not possible to pay full attention, because noesis is willful. It's going to think about something. If it ain't thinking about this, it's going to think about something else. Very few people have the ability to genuinely meditate for long where they let themselves fully enter gnosis for any length. And even the people who do it a lot will tell you that sometimes it's very difficult, even after years or decades of practice. Your brain just doesn't want to be in the moment sometimes. So, the attempt to recapture that pure pathos of gnosis, where you can be 100% in the moment without thinking about it and actively wrestling with it, very hard for adults. Very hard. I'm with you, Phil. I'm just more present if I listen actively than if I try to listen passively. And if I try to listen passively, frequently I completely forget later what exactly it was that we talked about. It may have changed me. My subconscious may be developed, my whole value system may be changed, but I can't put my finger on what changed because I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't, my noesis wasn't paying attention. And therefore it became an unconscious experience instead of a conscious one. It's a fascinating paradox. But again, this is that theme, right? That Heraclitean, Kenneth Smithian theme over and over when we look at the infinities involved in the actual nature playing out. The only way to reconcile an answer with fidelity about what's happening is to end up with a paradox. We do a better job of immersing ourselves in the pathos of learning when we do so actively using the praxis of noesis. It's like, how can that be? Well, you know, what can I say? We're a conundrum. It's the way we're structured. James, good to see you.
Yes,
What
nice to be here.
do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I want to ask just a basic question. Do you think this kind of dialectical logic is this kind of interaction of the two parts of the bicameral mind that you were just talking about? And does that kind of this kind of dialectical logic in Hegel and also perhaps in the Greeks entail a kind of the assumption of essence of the whole, and like the whole is what Hegel mentions as a kind of a beginning point of the logic, right? The dialectical logic. So there's like this kind of wholeness. Is that the argument of Parmenides? You know, that there is just the one and that we always begin and end with a one, and it doesn't go anywhere beyond that. So you know, that's that kind of fascinates me. If in order to engage this kind of logic, does it entail an assumption of wholeness and the one?
Yeah, so excellent question. You know, imagine, if you will, two different models of the whole. And obviously there will be a dialectical relationship between them, but I'm not going to focus on that at the moment. One concept of the whole is this Heraclitean Hegelian concept, in which we are not just one, we are many, and we form a whole if and when those many harness themselves together into a self-reinforcing dynamic system. And the going back kind of to the theme of this paragraph, the self-reinforcing dynamic system is what makes it possible for the whole to resist and or adapt to the centrifugal vicissitudes of life. As it gets knocked around in the tides of life, as its own internal forces push it this way and that, if it has a dynamic system like an amoeba or a trout in a river, it can absorb the energy and redirect it in order to keep going. So this is the whole that creates itself dialectically, a Heraclitean whole. But Parmenides was a purist. He insisted on a whole that had no parts. He said the whole must be uniform from inside to out. It must be circular, because that is the most perfect shape. It must encompass all things, because if there's an other, then it can't be whole. It feels a tension between the self and the other, and that might lead to the dialectic, oh God, we have to do away with that. So he sort of imagined a totalitarian, well, you know, what Kenneth Smith says is that Parmenides invented the tautology. True is true, being is. The informationless whole that is so whole, it leaves no room for anything and becomes a kind of vacuum. It's an anti-dialectic that Parmenides is postulating. And he postulates, this isn't an interpretation, he postulates it with great force. He argues that it is not possible for anything to exist anywhere at any time unless existence is uniform and without shape, and you know, there's no differences. So it is a perfect totalitarian cosmos that he's modeling, in which there's no diversity. There's not even sameness. You can't even have two things that are the same. You only get one. This is, you know, Kenneth likes to say, as crazed as this philosophy is, only an Aristos could have come up with it, because it's so relentless. He finds every possible seam in the argument and redefines the whole in order to exclude it, to create a perfect uniformity that has no gaps. So I wouldn't call it a Parmenidean whole. I would call it a Heraclitean whole, because the Parmenidean whole excludes every other possible thing. And the Heraclitean whole incorporates things in order to create the whole. But otherwise, I'm right with you. There is a way in which the concept of unity that we could take out of Parmenides, as long as we jettison his weird purity stuff, that concept of unity, and it helps us to understand the whole that the living organism is trying to create. It wants to continue. It wants to be complete. And its way of being complete is such that it's not satisfied just being itself. It also has to relate to what's around it. That's why the amoeba is always reaching out, always exploring. It wants to relate to the larger universe around it so that the universe and the amoeba together can create a relationship that becomes the new whole. And it's in that relationship that life becomes possible. There's a little bit of Parmenideanism in it, but I think of it more as Heraclitean.
Yeah, but in Hegel, there's it begins with the essence, right? The essence is the whole, right?
Yes.
And so there is an assumption there from the very beginning. It's like a religious or metaphysical, vision of the whole. Yeah. But is that kind of like jumping over existence and discounting the phenomenology of existence in order to posit the whole? And you begin, the argument from there, being, and then negation, so.
Yeah. Well, you can come down on this on either side, the existentialist side or the escapist side. And the existentialist side says that existence and essence can't be treated as completely separate categories, or else you're going to end up with some kind of escapism. It has to be the case that existence and essence interpenetrate and are interdependent on each other. This is like the question of transcendentalism. Is it a universe that has no meaning, and that either God imposed the meaning from without when he created it, or we moderns are free to impose our meaning upon it, and that's what gives it meaning? Or are we going with the immanentalist ancient position, which is that the universe is meaningful, which is why it can exist at all, and that meaning therefore is not to be imposed transcendentally, but to be discovered immanently within it? This is the existentialist position. And it would be the same for the dichotomy you're talking about. Existence and essence would be treated as interdependent.
Right. So the existentialist position, holds that we are trying to create meaning, right?
Yes.
That kind of trying is a desire.
Yes.
The desire for this kind of sense of oneness.
Yes.
And but if you like in the Tao Te Ching, he says that with desire you see the many, without desire you see the one. So if you want to see the one, you're going to have to discount your desires, which is your existence in the world. So those are kind of like it's kind of a paradox.
It is.
You have one or the other. If you want both, you're kind of like caught in a conundrum.
A paradox, right?
Yeah.
That's right on, James. That's the human condition in a nutshell, right? That there is this as Homo sapiens being an animal whose trick is culture. Part of what that means is that we are an animal with a big hole inside of us, the HOLE kind of hole. There's an emptiness where our distant forebears were full of instincts and we're missing them, and as a result we have an uncertainty and a hungriness to become complete, to feel at home, and not so nervous and anxious. This drive in us it drives us to seek out opportunities to create a larger whole out of and now it's a WHOLE hole. Thank you, English. To fill the hole by creating a hole. that by relating ourselves to ourselves and to nature around us, we can feel complete and not so isolated and anxious.
Right. Jean-Paul Sartre, for me, kind of nailed it. He says that our existence is an ontological drive or desire to be God, right? But we would never be God, because if we did, we wouldn't be ourselves. We wouldn't be alive or something.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So every desire that you have, you're hungry. You seek food to fill up yourself in order to feel this kind of ontological completeness, right? Fullness.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it is the desire to be God, to be whole, detotalized totality.
Yeah. I mean, the feeling of the sacred for many people is the feeling of, having that connection to a larger whole. That's what defines the sacred for a lot of people. And you can see why, given that sort of anxious nervousness that's kind of wired into us from the beginning. This also goes to why, humanity is an artistic species. It's, if you did put us in an Eden, in a Garden of Eden, we would pretty soon start looking for ways to decorate the place where we sit, or, maybe I can plant some of these seeds and make more plants, or the need to express that motive drive in us is very, it's very strong. And it goes back to what we said a few minutes ago. Why is it that even the greatest Zen masters say that there are days when they cannot shut off their noesis and they struggle to find that meditative state? And it's because, well, that's how we are. As long as you're going to be human, there's going to be days when you cannot be 100% gnosis, even if you practice it all your life. The brain is going to resist because it wants to be restless and get out and find a greater hole to put itself into. So it's good stuff, James. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So, let's look at the text. So most people, said Oscar Wilde, are other people. They have no more personality than the mirror. Now, when Oscar Wilde said this, he said this with the greatest contempt. Let's be clear. Oscar Wilde knew that he was an individual. He knew that even though he was a product of his age, he was also a self-creation of his age. Very few people were more of an individual than Oscar Wilde in the documented history that we have. It's not that nobody was, but he stands out as being quite a quirky person. Who was very aware of himself and the people around him and their relationships to each other and his relationships to them and so on. He knew that he was not only other people. He knew that, there was a big component of that, but that he had more personality than a mirror, and that he had self-created a lot of the parts of himself that he took the most pride in. It's why he was a writer. It's why his writings are so often satires and not gross, pounding you over the head satires, as fun as those are, like Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, but really witty satires in which the most witty satirical characters who stand apart in his plays are sooner or later hoist on their own petards, and they have to laugh at themselves. It's always the structure of an Oscar Wilde play that, the Archimedean standpoint that Kenneth Smith talks about is only partially granted to the wittiest of characters. Sooner or later, they too have to wield it against themselves, as Kafka said, and they become the butt of the joke as well. So that capacity for introspection, that capacity to turn one's skeptical eyes around back onto oneself, all of those things are part of that Hegelian process of developing the third mode of existence, the heuristic mode of existence. And Oscar Wilde knew that's what he was up to. So when he says this sentence, there's no doubt that Oscar Wilde is he's being judgy, right? He's using pathetically in the other sense, in the screw you guys. Yeah, you can lock me in prison, but it doesn't change the fact that you all are sort of Xerox copies of each other, and I'm a person, and you've ganged up against me because you can't stand to have an actual individual walking among you. It offends you, and so here I am in jail, and what am I supposed to do about that? He's judging. But part of the reason for that, other than the injustices that he was suffering and the bitterness he felt about that, is that he didn't have a Kierkegaardian understanding of why most people are other people, why it must necessarily be so, just like every fruit grows out of a blossom that grows out of a bud. You can't just be the fruit. There's just a little bit of Kantian idealism or escapism hiding in Oscar Wilde's judgment, because of course most people are other people. Of course they have no more personality than me. We all start that way. We have to. That's the beginning point. I mean, when you are an infant with 100% gnosis, there's no noesis to be doing any critical evaluation of the options around you or yourself. You don't even know what it means to be a self. You don't even fully understand your parents are other people. I mean, the things that they've learned about child psychology and development in recent decades have been fantastic. But there is this stage that infants go through where when the parent meets their needs, the child doesn't have a clear sense that this is some other person meeting their needs. They're just experiencing their needs being met. And then things get better. And, the concept that I'm me and they're them, and thank goodness they were paying attention to me enough to care and caring to meet my needs. None of that is present at first. That all comes later. They have to figure the things that an infant has to figure out to understand itself is such a long, staggering list that it makes us have to reconsider what we do every day in the most ordinary activities of adulthood that we take for granted. It's like enormous amounts of labor and aha experiences and epiphanies had to occur to get us to the point where we could be bored with life. For example, that's to be a bored person sitting around going, I wish something would happen, is the product of an enormous amount of personal struggle and development to get out of the initial stage in which nothing is ever boring and it's all sort of overwhelming, to be honest. Oh my God, I have to burp. It's like there's something to be said for not being traumatized every time you have to burp or fart or something. There's a lot of growth that has to happen. So the same is true in the culture at large and in the population at large. A lot of people are going to stop at an earlier stage of development because of the way for whatever reason, for a variety of reasons. But the people like Oscar Wilde who go further than that still need to take a Hegelian awareness. They ought to take a Hegelian awareness to who they are, that the only reason they got to where they are is by getting there through that stage that they're currently demonizing. Now, this isn't the point Kenneth Smith's trying to make here, but it is a Smithian point. And I bring it up because of its context. So then he says that inauthentic existence of being a mirror is indeed what being one of the many means to the ancient Greeks. You will, in the Greeks, over and over, whether in Plato, in Aristotle, in Heraclitus, or elsewhere, you will constantly see the dichotomy of the one and the many, the one and the many. Heraclitus says, for they do not understand that the good are few and the many are bad. Heraclitus makes this point of the one and the many over and over. He's talking about the need for individuation, the need to develop yourself beyond being just a fruit of your culture, to engaging your praxis to the task lifelong of shaping yourself so that you can more authentically, bye Geneva, good to see you, so that you can more authentically be yourself by abstracting yourself from yourself, observing yourself, and then actively engaging in cultivating the growth of yourself. That is, no human being can fully be who they are without a strong element of artifice in which they don't just be who they are, but also shape who they are at the same time, in violation of who they are. Seemingly in violation. If we were sticking to strict categories of you are who you are, or you make yourself artificially be something, that seems to exclude the possibility that the only way to fully be who you are is to artificially shape yourself, but to do so in accordance with the laws of development already at work in yourself. It's like when you're gardening, right? You can't make plants do things those plants aren't naturally capable of doing. You're gonna ruin your garden. It's not gonna work out. And it's the same with gardening yourself. You have to have enough introspection and self-awareness and study to figure out what makes you tick as a person and how you're developing and changing. But once you know that, once you learn even a little bit of that, you could water certain plants more. You could do a little weeding. You can start to get involved in your garden carefully, gently, and your garden might end up much better than it would have if you left it alone. And so, which garden is more authentically itself? The one that's mostly dead because it never got watered, or the one that's flourishing and blooming and dropping fruits all over the place? And the answer is, well, it's a paradox. Right? You know, the insistence that we settle on one or the other of these choices as being more real is what gets us into trouble. We have to understand the nature of the human existence. And the nature of the human mind is that we've got this naturalizing, whole forming part of ourselves, and we've got this artificializing, planning part of ourselves, and they're both part of us, the natural and the artificial. You can't just say man is a natural animal like any other animal, because then there's this artificial half that you're ignoring. And you can't just say we are whatever we make of ourselves, because yeah, there's artifice, but there's also this natural part of ourselves. Literally, to be ourselves means to deploy both parts of ourselves to authentically express the whole complex paradox of human existence. And this is buried here in this question of authentic existence and inauthentic existence. So when he says that inauthentic existence is indeed what being one of the many means to the Greeks, and in the rest of the sentence, an atrophy of the higher functions that define humans as truly human. The higher functions, right? We're talking about Verstand. We're talking about moving past naive gnosis and naive noesis to being able to wield them both in a mature form that's introspective and aware of itself and able to cultivate itself and not just suffer the world and not just impose itself on the world, but engage in this complex shifting dance with the world, in which sometimes we do one, sometimes we do the other, in order ideally not only to bring ourselves to a fuller fruiting, but also to help the world on which we depend come to a fuller fruiting, so that we have a healthier place to be within it, to create a greater whole, as Christopher Alexander said. Right? Christopher Alexander says the categories, you can have a powerful center that you would think has life, and another powerful center that seems to have its own life too. But it's better when the two centers know about each other and relate to each other in such a way that for each center, the presence of the other one makes it stronger, and they're both stronger together than they are by themselves. That's a more living system. It has more vitality and life than the one of the disconnected individuals. The same is true in the other direction. You can't just have a whole that stamps out little Xerox parts in a totalitarian, insistence that they all be the same. You can't have the whole dominate the parts, because that leads to sterility. The centers like that can't reinforce each other. They're not alive. They're not sensing each other. They're not adapting to each other and improving themselves and one another and their relationships. If you let things adapt and shift and improve, they will break up rigid symmetries like you get from Xeroxing people or buildings. They'll break that up, and they'll detect the differences, and they'll create stronger wholes that are made up of things that are at the same time obviously related, but also different from each other, depending on where they find themselves positioned and what the exact balance of forces is at each of those locations. The relationship between the part and the whole is very complicated to create a living system. And so it is with gnosis and noesis. To create a whole person involves wielding artifice and nature together in a very weird asymmetrical way in order to try to create a living dynamic system. And then the same becomes true of the relationship of the individual to the culture, the part to the whole, just like Christopher Alexander's describing. All that's bound up in here, even though Kenneth's not quoting Christopher, but it's all bound up in here in this idea that what we need, the reason that we need to develop Vernunft, the reason that we need to develop the third faculty, the mature faculty, is that's the only time that we finally break free of the basal functions in order to get the Archimedean standpoint, to see the limitations of the basal functions and the kind of sterile solutions they tend to stamp out, and to come up with the ability to think orthogonally and relate them and ourselves to the world in a healthier way that transcends the sort of straitjackets of one or the other mode of thought. So when he says that, you know, what it means to be one of the many is to live an inauthentic existence. If you are using only the dualic mode, then you're cutting yourself off from the artifice and the planning and the willfulness. And that's artificial. That lack of artificiality is artificial. It is not natural to us to exclude the artifice, because we can't be whole without it. We need to make things and shape things and engage with the world. Or else, as Phil says, we fall asleep during the lecture. It could be the greatest lecture in the world, but we might not remember any of it if we're not actively engaged with it. And that's what it's like with the rest of life. But the same is true on the other side. If all we do is the artifice and will ourselves to make all the decisions consciously, if we say, I want to be 100% fully woke, and I don't ever want to suffer a pathos, I want to choose everything for myself and my culture, and it will all be deliberate and conscious. That too is an inauthentic existence, because it's cutting ourselves off from the half of us that needs to relate to the world through pathos. So it is a fascinating situation that we find ourselves in, where things that modernity tells us are mutually exclusive both have to be present in full measure for us to live an authentic life. And anything less than that is some kind of distorted, warped form of human life. This is what he's talking about here in this sequence. The Greeks understood some of this dialectic. They understood the need to struggle against mere mimicry of the people around us. And whether you're mimicking their behavior and their feelings and their habits and traditions, or whether you're mimicking their ideologies and their logic and their systems, either way, mere mimicry isn't going to cut it. It's the only way not to be just some kind of mirror, is you've got to develop that third faculty and begin to judge and taste and mediate among them. So, Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you for that extended explanation. It was actually quite wonderful. But I want to go back to what James said, and it's because actually that's fundamental to what you just said in a deep way. The relationship between the whole and existence and life. And James mentioned the Tao, right? There was a problem with the Tao. And I'll need Joseph's help maybe, because I sort of like stopped my relationship with that particular seminar. And so he continued. And I remember at a point when the Tao was introduced, and there was kind of that question of between the one through the way and existence. And the Tao as it's currently, as is usually talked about, it's incomplete because it's not the Tao, it's the Tao De Ching. Okay. The De is how it's applied to existence, right? And I remember when that was said, I was a little surprised. And I said, yeah, that's a difficult problem. And it's like, I think even Lao Tzu couldn't handle the De, because he can't handle the truth. It's like the whole thing, right? How do you position that? And I think that became a problem, I think, in Chinese philosophy, because the De was never successfully handle, or not even to the degree the Greeks did. Because what became the de facto was Confucianism, which is not for nuns, but kenosis, right? And that becomes, I would say, even though somewhat benevolent society, but it still was a authoritarian society. And that's what became the problem. And I think that's always been a problem, is how do you handle the Tao with the De, or being and existence? I mean, that's a fundamental question that the Greeks were always wrestling with. But at least they were trying to wrestle with it. And it's almost an unanswerable question in a way. And that's why it needs to be rolled out in a dynamic way, because it's constantly remanifesting itself in some form. And that's the only way to keep it alive, rather than, let's say, oh, we settle on the system, this is what it is. And Confucius is very, very wise at dealing with that. And that's simply not true. So if Joseph, if you want to enter into this conversation and flesh it out a little bit more, because as I said,
it was a gap for me as well. I mean, it's the Tao actually, tells us, kind of leads us to how to live within nature.
Yeah.
But and that's why I appreciate Stoicism, because it does apply logic and reason to nature. And so that's kind of where they differ. It's like, and it was a problem for me. And you're absolutely right, because I'm now going through Confucius, and you can kind of see where Confucius steps in, but it almost becomes, it does become authoritarian, in that this is the only way that you can live, and it's instilling order to where, essentially it's trying to instill order to, I don't know, chaos, essentially, to the cosmos. And I mean, so I think that I need it. That's why I kind of need both of them. I like the Tao for what it brings to me about understanding nature. It's fundamental. But there's not enough how you act in the world. There's not enough, and not that I need a prescription, but I need something, that helps me, at least, to at least to some principles to manage my life. But I don't need Confucius telling me that I have to, mourn my parents for 3 years after they die, and exactly, what it means to be, essentially how each class structure or class, needs to behave. I mean, I think that that's just prescriptive. And I think that that's, but I appreciate what you said, Phil, because that was one of the things that I kind of need the Greeks and Chinese wisdom in order to really be complete. But
I remember when that was at the Deuce, I could hear Jack Nicholson ringing in my ear. You can't handle the truth.
Yeah, there is a truth to that. Yeah, no pun intended. Yeah, there is a truth that, and it is challenging to handle. That being said, I do find the idea of Wu Wei and the Tao to be extremely settling. So that's just my thoughts. But well, I appreciate
thank you, Joseph.
Phil. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both. Yeah, that's great. James, go ahead. You got your hand up. Oh, sorry. I tried to take you off mute, and instead I put you on mute. Go ahead and come off.
Okay, thanks, Phil, for bringing it back to that central question I was trying to get at. So you think the Tao at least goes beyond Parmenides, right? It is not the kind of Tao that he's talking about is not a totalitarian right?
Right.
Whole.
Right.
But it is a kind of it is a kind of a dialectic, isn't it?
It is.
It is a dialectical logic, that's within in that way of thinking, and but it is a kind of a way of bringing us back to our existence in nature, right? That we can live
You're right.
within nature, and
You're right.
also
It's not as bounded as Parmenides, certainly.
right,
I
exactly.
agree with that totally.
Yeah.
But comparing with Heraclitus, is there any justification? Is enough to compare with what Heraclitus is also saying there?
Yeah, that question has exercised philosophers so much. There are people who've written entire books on just that question. It's like, did one of them read the other? Or, were their ideas passed along the Silk Road, and they encountered each other? And they ask because how do you explain so many overlaps when they grew up in such wildly different cultures? I mean, all the details of the cultures were very different. I mean, Chinese civilization at that stage was in a very different place from where Greek civilization was. Greek civilization was just a few centuries away from toppling itself, after desperately, of all things, trying not to topple itself, knowing that it had that risk. The dynamic going on in the Greek world was very different than the Chinese world. And yet, here are these discussions of the interpenetration of opposites forming the whole, and so forth. And but I think what's happening, although it's certainly possible that they were exposed to each other's work one way or the other, that doesn't actually have to be true. We don't have to resolve the question, because both of them agree that nature is the way it is, whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not. And so the more you immerse yourself in nature, the more opportunities you give nature to teach you how it is. And so anybody anywhere in the world, from any culture, if they immerse themselves in nature in the right way, should be capable of deducing the Tao, the Day, the dialectic, because it's there. It's there to be found, waiting for us to notice.
Right. So maybe Hegel, because of his lack of understanding about the Chinese culture at that time, was right in the sense that this dialectical logic is pretty universal, huh?
Yeah.
I mean,
that you don't have to escape from nature into his philosophy in order to appreciate the dialectic, because it's there to be found in nature, just waiting for us to notice it. And like Heraclitus says, it's not just waiting there to be found in the nature outside of us, it's also waiting there to be found in the nature inside of us. Our character and its structure is also dialectical. And if anything, it's like the two together offer us a triangulation of signposts. You could start from either obsession, but if you pay enough attention, it'll point you to where the dialectic is to be discovered. So it's an interesting topic. I mean, I always think over and over of the swordfish, the ichthyosaurus, and the dolphin, and how all three of them started out with their distant ancestors had completely different body shapes, but because of the lifestyle they led, which is very similar in all three cases, that they were going to be big, strong swimmers that chased down and captured fish. It's like, well, then you're fighting the forces of the ocean in a certain distinctive way, and that distinctive way, that te, will shape you to fit the Tao, because of the relationship that you've created between yourself and these forces. If you succeed, it will be because you come to look like a swordfish or a dolphin or an ichthyosaurus. It's like, if you don't want to look like one of them, you better live a different life, because otherwise it's going to mold you. There's a fascinating line in Heraclitus. It's one of these fragments that seems to come out of nowhere and not be related to any other until you have conversations like this and realize how appropriate it is. I've come back to it a number of times. He says it's wearying to always keep working at the same thing and thus be ruled by it. And at first it sounds like he's just complaining. I mean, right, that's how it opens. But the more you think about it, the more he's describing convergence. right? The person who works as a blacksmith, no matter where they work in the world as a blacksmith, is going to end up with certain commonalities with all of their blacksmiths, because the relentless toil of that particular form will stamp itself upon you, and it will help to shape your character. But if you're a fisherman, no matter where you are in the world and you're fishing, you're going to get certain commonalities with all other fishermen everywhere else in the world, because it's a different lifestyle than the blacksmith's lifestyle, and it will shape itself upon you, just like the ocean and that lifestyle shapes itself upon the reptile and the mammal and the fish until they look like each other. So I think, considering that he's the philosopher of the dialectic, I think there's more at work in that parable than I once thought there was. And he's talking about the nature of convergence. If you want to be a fully fledged person who can do many different things, then you can't just always do the same work, because otherwise the work will shape you to fit itself, well, and therefore to fit other things less well. And this is that thing of that moderns don't like. We like to hallucinate the idea of a species that's infinitely flexible and adaptable and can do all things, but there's no such thing. That's not how nature works at all. To be more fit, you have to be shaped by a thing to fit it. And if you fit it better, then you're going to fit other things worse. That's just the way evolution works. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to go a bit off the mark at the moment, but getting back to the question of Oedipus.
Oh, yeah.
Rudolf Steiner claimed in one of his better moments, he did have a few good things to say. And he said that Oedipus represents the Greco-Roman civilization, and their problem is that they were too immersed in what was around them. They didn't have the ability to stand back and say, well, this is what's going wrong. And that was the problem of Oedipus. You have that bit where he's first warned by the drunkard or whatever that you're not really the child of the Corinthian rulers.
Yeah.
And then Oedipus, goes to the oracle after that, and the oracle says, well, you're destined to kill your father and marry your mother. And he's horrified, and immediately he does the worst thing he could possibly do, is run away from Corinth, because he doesn't actually know who his real father and mother are. He's guaranteed he might run into him. Steiner went and said that Faust is more the problem of our age. Faust has become too remote in his feelings from everything. He's the scientist just sitting there thinking, it's all so boring.
Yeah.
I want some excitement in my life. And then he creates his own tragedy on that line. But, Tiresias was saying to Oedipus, how is it that you, who have two good eyes, cannot see the truth that I can see even though I'm blind?
Yeah, I'm going to need to search out that Rudolf Steiner essay and read it, because, you're reporting very interesting observations by Steiner.
I'll look for the link.
That would be great. Yeah, I would love to read that. Thank you. Well, we have a little bit of time left, and I'm going to go ahead and just drop in the next paragraph, because obviously he's on a roll here now. He's reached the part of this section C where the arguments are building on each other, and he's got a flow. So I think we can pretty safely move on. It says, form must be intimately correlative to its specific matter. This is what we've been saying before, right? That you can't just impose yourself on anything. You try to wield your form to shape something. That only works if you are also willing to be shaped by it. As Aristotle advised his conquering pupil Alexander, do not expect to rule democracy-loving Athenians as you might barbarians. To rule them differently according to the forces of their culture and their character. The fit of form to matter is decisive. The laws a people formulates must be appropriate to their character and quality of community. The way a parent, a teacher, or a religious leader appeals to his charges must be harmonious with their specific characters. And when he says teacher, you know this is that reference to, if you want to be a great teacher, you can't teach the subject, you have to teach the students. You figure out who they are, and that tells you how they can approach the subject. You can't just stamp out the subject the way you like to hear it, because the only audience for which that's ideal is yourself. And they're not you, they're different people. Every teacher has to learn this lesson, and here it is alluded to right here. Humans are not utter exceptions within the entangled order of nature, but indeed suffer its dilemmas in acute ways when we are split on these paradoxes, seemingly between an either-or choice, where we have to go one way or the other. Our character comes to the fore. Just like it would for anything else. We must make ourselves conscious of the forms that are appropriate in our communal and individual lives. And we must cultivate those forms according to their own intrinsic needs. So this is about, you can see how this follows directly off the earlier paragraph. This is about the question of how do you self-cohere into a living, viable system that can have a lifespan. And the only way you can do that is if you pay attention to the forms of your character as an individual or as a culture, because that character and the virtues at work in it correspond to the logos of nature that Heraclitus talks about, the natural laws and the archai that are the fountains of order within it. So it is exactly the same with us, our character and its virtues and vices. You have to see that landscape and understand it to figure out what you have to work with, to know which things can be bent which ways and which ones can't. Thank you so much. I will go read that after this lecture. That's fantastic. Yay, happy. So this is what he's talking about here. And this is what we've been saying all session, right? This is a summation of kind of what we've been discussing. It pulls together this whole theme of the relationship of form and matter and the duty of the individual to cultivate themselves. Why we have to struggle to transcend the dualic or Banausic life cycle. Why we need to try to develop the heuristic within ourselves, because it is the heuristic perspective that is liberated enough from naive gnosis and naive noesis to be able to detect the landscape of our character rather than trying to impose its preconceptions upon that landscape. The more we see the way it really is, the better a job we'll do of cultivating it. You know, the impatient person who goes out into the garden and digs up the little plant every day to see if it's going to sprout doesn't get any plants. I didn't name you. So it's the person who has had enough experience with the plants and knows something about their ways, who knows what you can and can't do with it if you want it to grow well. And maybe we all start by digging up the plant every day, and that's how we learn not to do it. But we need to develop that experience and be able to transcend our initial impressions. And only Aristeia is entirely about that overcoming of the perspective, to be able to see what's beyond it, to see the truth obscured by the lenses and mirrors of our vision. I'm going to do Joseph and then Phil. Go ahead, Joseph.
I'll just briefly say, I mean, and I've brought this up in the past, this kind of seems like almost like an architectural principle of form follows function, where something like the purpose of something has to follow, the form or create the form. And so the idea that, that something like an educational system can be completely just one size fits all or something along those lines, it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right. Because it loses to, because each individual learns differently. So this is kind of the problem with the industrialized world. This is kind of what I'm taking away from this.
That's right.
So anyway, that's just a comment.
Yeah, Kenneth Smith's critique of the modern world derives entirely, it's not because he doesn't like the modern world and so he looks for philosophical excuses to rationalize his distaste. It's that, the ways the modern world disregards these fundamental questions that the ancients understood to be right at the heart of how you decide what kind of civilization to have. It's because of those violations that he dislikes the modern world. And he dislikes the modern world specifically, not as a general prejudice, but specifically in these ways and for these reasons. I saw you came off mute. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking it kind of, speaks to, the problem with imperialism too. It's this idea that even when I like how he uses the example of the Athenians and the barbarians can't necessarily be kind of, governed in the same fashion. Like everybody needs their own way of actually being able to organize themselves. So this gets down back to something like a spontaneous order. There's a spontaneous order to the world, and that when we try to impose our order on it, it's highly problematic.
Exactly. And in case anybody doesn't remember it, the rest of the story about Aristotle and Alexander is what Aristotle told Alexander is that the Greeks love to fight, and they love to fight against people who are trying to impose themselves on the Greeks. As long as you leave the Greeks alone, they'll squabble amongst each other. But the moment you attack them, they will unite against you because they like nothing better than to be the underdog trying to take down Goliath. They love that. And you'd have to exterminate them all. Because if there's even one Greek left anywhere, he'll be a one-person revolution against you. And he's smart and creative. He's going to be a real thorn in your side. He's not going to be some grit in the Vaseline. He's going to be obnoxious. But the Greeks love to be persuaded. They hate conquest, but they adore persuasion. So if you can fire their imaginations with the idea that you're not their enemy, you are merely trying to express their values, to show the world how great your values are. So if you're trying to show the world how great their values are, then they'll love you for it. And then they will fiercely follow you and fight for you instead of against you. That's what Aristotle told Alexander. He said, you have to become a stupor mundi. You have to stagger their imagination and capture, catch a flame, the imaginations of the world, and make them not able to look away from you, make them want to be like you, because you're trying to be like them, because you're saying all you're doing is helping them be their best people. You do that and it'll work. And that's exactly what Alexander did, and it worked because Aristotle knew what he was talking about. It's become fashionable to diss Aristotle as, those medievals, they were rigidly tied to Aristotle, and that's what held back science. You'll hear this all the time. It's typically from historians of science who don't know anything about philosophy or history. But of course, the truth is, Aristotle wasn't trying to set up a dogma for all time. He was trying to observe trenchantly what was going on at the moment. His theories didn't have to be the absolute true theories. They just had to be better than the stupid theories they had before him. That's all he was trying to do, is move the ball down the field. And you can see that with his observation about how Alexander could possibly rule the Greeks, because the proof is in the pudding. He did. They loved it. They transformed their entire civilization from the Hellenic to the Hellenistic, and created a vast empire in which it wasn't just a know-nothing empire like the Romans were. It was a philosophical empire in which they were passing around literacy and aphorisms and religion, and exchanging. It was a cosmopolitan, very interesting structure that they created. I'm not saying it was a good structure, but I'm saying Aristotle was right. I mean, if Alexander had just tried to conquer the Greeks and punish them and make them submit, nothing like that could possibly have happened. He basically, instead of having the wood and the string of the bow fight each other and destroy each other, he strung them together and created a powerful dynamic system. Phil, go ahead.
Thanks for Joseph's comment, but I had a slightly different comment, and is that it seems like Aristotle was already transforming the beginning of humanism. It's not surprising in that regard that when the Renaissance came in the emerging in terms of early modernism, that they looked at the Greeks, even though they were more embedded in the Roman culture. They looked at the Greeks as an ideal because it was the beginning of humanism, but that had already been sort of instituted in a way. So that so there is really a kind of interesting connection between, the Greeks. I shouldn't call it the ancients in general, but the Greeks and the moderns in that one sense, because that connected the how should I say, the authenticity and the connection of this sort of humanist thought to this new possibilities of reality. Now that could cause a problem in itself, but nonetheless, I think that's kind of interesting that so early on, that in a sense humanism had always been introduced. It certainly wasn't the case in like in Babylonia or Egypt, or the Persians of that kind, but it's really centered on to a certain degree individuals, but individuals in a collective. So that was very interesting. And I think that relationship, is well throughout. I mean, I think the Declaration of Independence had a lot to do with that as well. Well, also had a lot to do with the Roman laws, but nonetheless, I think that connection, it's partly just a tradition of history, but it isn't a mystery that it connected to that rather than, let's say, Hindu philosophy, or whatever. So it is interesting that we focus so much in the humanism, which has its own problems, I do believe, but nonetheless, it was an important connection. Thank you. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Joseph. Well, I think we'll wrap up here because we're right at the top of the hour. And we finished up a paragraph. We're in a good position to start it next time. I'm going to read this. I'm going to read this Rudolf Steiner essay. Thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate it. It just sounds fascinating. And we'll pick this up next week. Again, we're about midway through section C now, and we're making good progress. As like I promised, we get to this point where enough of the core ideas have been established in sections A and B. We're starting to be able to move faster through section C, and it doesn't require quite as much unpacking. Some of it's been done for us already.
Well, I myself like the pace, but it just seems like a pace of long distance runner.
Yeah. I like it too, but I know some people are impatient, so I'm just trying to reassure them that we're getting there. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great week.
Thanks a lot. Thanks everybody.